Let the scriptures speak for themselves.
All right, we are live. And hey, David, I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation here today. And I hope it'll be helpful for everyone. Been praying about this a lot and really hope that, as we look at some different passages together and talk about something you're very familiar with, as you've been teaching this stuff for a long time, which we'll get into in just a second, that maybe people can look on and learn, and hear some of those views. So I just wanted to, again, thank you publicly for, again, taking the time to let me interview you and pick your brain a little bit on some of these eschatology questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Grant. This is a pleasure. And I was just glad that you contacted me, and I took a look at what you've done on your channel, was really impressed with that. And I think you have a lot to bring to the scripture, a lot of knowledge. You have some background that helps you with that in schooling. And man, as you go through the scriptures, sometimes you dive a lot deeper than I go. And I like that. Some points you've made on the, I think it's surrounding especially the historical nature and context of some of the things in the Gospels, I was really impressed with. And so, yeah, I'm happy to do this, and I'm glad to meet a fellow brother. And, we're all on this journey together. So I'm just glad to be a part, let's do it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, cool. The first thing I wanted to start off with as we jump into this longer discussion concerning the end times, eschatology, is I wanted to talk a little bit about your background, and specifically in your background, what maybe you would have held to growing up as far as end times, eschatology, what you were raised with, and then maybe, if I've understood you correctly, how that changed, what scriptures led you to that change, what kind of research and readings led you there, and what was it like as a Christian navigating these waters? Were there people, helping you navigate through this, or was this just David and his Bible in a room, or, how did that go about?
Yeah. So, my background is that I was at a very young age, I became a Christian. I was raised in a Christian family, and my parents both, I suppose the term you'd use is conservative Baptists. I wouldn't say fundamental. My parents, when they were early married, lived in California, so they had kind of a, Western attitude, but were definitely conservative in their belief and values. So, my dad, he actually was going to seminary at the time when I was born, and he spent a lot of time instilling that in me, teaching me. He had flashcards. It was great. I have lots of great memories with my dad going through that stuff. And I knew at age 3 that I wanted Jesus Christ to be my King and Savior. And it wasn't some complicated thing to me. It was just, I knew who God was and Jesus was his son. I was, a sinner. I had done things wrong. I didn't want to do things wrong, and I want to follow that, And so when people sometimes hear that age and they're like, well, you're too young to know what no, I mean, I think I knew the basics, and as time went on, I grew with him, and, that knowledge fleshed out. So that's kind of how I was raised. And, we attended different denominations of churches as I was growing up. And the way my dad would explain it to me is, he just wanted to go where the Bible was truly taught, as correctly as possible. And we were hearing the truth of the scriptures instead of going off on tangents or whatever. So we attended some Baptist churches. I attended some Presbyterian churches. Also, occasionally I went to some Church of God type churches. But, all in all, it was all about seeking the truth, and wherever that led us, my father and our family. So I've just always been a lot like my dad in that. And so, that leaning towards teaching. And you see me doing that now online, but
Sure. Love
I've taught Sunday school classes. I've taught Sunday school classes in the churches I've been a part of for years, decades, really. My wife's the same way. She's a teacher as well. But my work on YouTube really feels like an extension of that. When I think back on when I was teaching in the brick and mortars, it was the same thing. I was doing the same thing. So the thing that made me kind of start my channel and come into what I'm doing now, and there were two things really. One is that, and this was about maybe 6 years ago, God started burdening me just with like this voracious appetite to read. So I was reading, it started with the Bible. I read through the Bible like a few times, I don't know. And then the way I would study the Bible would be take a book of the Bible and read through it like 5 times in a week or
Sure.
2 or 3 times in a day,
Yeah.
So I really started to grasp the context of each letter that was written and why the author wrote it. And, the context surrounding it made a lot more sense when I did that. But that reading took me into other writings besides the Bible as well. So if you've seen in much of my channel, I've read pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, early church writings, early church fathers. I start to fade off when I get near the Council of Nicaea and after that time period, but before then, that's what I like. That's my wheelhouse.
That's cool.
So I've read, and I'm talking about just reading straight through that. I've even read stuff from other religions that's ancient and so anyway, I had this kind of like compulsion, and I knew it was from God. I just didn't know where it was leading. I was just reading, and I just couldn't stop. But then the other thing that kind of helped in my, way of coming into where I am was that I slowly started to come to this kind of preteristic belief in eschatology, understanding the things that happened in the first century, and what happened, what the Olivet Discourse was about, what the book of Daniel was about, which you teach a lot on your channel. And so I slowly kind of came full circle to this historical understanding of the fulfillments of the Old Testament. And that was a real, obviously, like for everybody, it's a paradigm shift, right? It's just like,
yeah.
The universe exploded. Holy crap, everything is different. Everything feels different anyway, even though, after having years behind me now where I look back, I'm like, it is different, but it's not that different. There's just some key things, that change. But that paradigm shift, now I was in and teaching a high school age Sunday school class at the time where that was happening. This was like
gotcha.
2 or 3 years ago. And so what happened when I had that paradigm shift, I had been for the past couple months teaching those boys the futurist dispensational eschatology.
Wow. Yeah.
Down the line.
Yeah, sure.
And now I realized, man, a lot of that stuff, that's not right. I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I had this kind of thing where I was like, what do I do? I can't go back and teach those boys something totally opposite, or different. I felt like that, and I was just learning it myself. I felt like that would be the wrong thing, that would somehow shake their faith a little bit. We had just gone through all that stuff. I was just like, I'll leave that be. But I did feel like because my views had changed so much that they didn't anymore align with the church, really, as far as their doctrinal statement.
Sure. The local church that you were attending. Yeah.
Exactly. And I just felt like, I need to probably step away and have some time to figure this out a little more. Right. Yeah. And figure out if, one, I was still learning it, but just I didn't want to do anything that would hurt those boys. They were the key there for me, the most important thing of that.
Yeah.
That class. So I did. I stepped away, and then that desire to teach didn't stop. So that's about the time that my YouTube channel really got started and kicked off. And praise God, here I am. A couple years later, it's going pretty good. I'm enjoying it. I connect with the users that see my channel a lot, and man, it's a blessing. It's a blessing to me and them, I think. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of your biggest videos, are you talking through some of these things, and there's not a lot of, it's not very mainstream, this view, concerning anything that's not a futurist view of eschatology. So I think there's people that are looking to hear that other side that, you're another great resource out there. So for me, when I was researching for the Olivet Discourse, you were another one of these guys that popped up. Who's this guy, and you were well researched, right?
What is he doing?
No. You were well researched, So for me and the kind of content I try to produce, I'm like, that's what I'm always looking for. Like, give me the facts. If I need to sort something out differently, I will. But you're just bringing me the truths and the verses, and all these things, and that's what I was looking for. So for me, your ministry that you're doing on YouTube, I think has been helpful for me. And I can totally understand that desire to step back and not confuse anybody when you're trying to sort through like you said, a major shift, right, in what you're believing.
Yeah, it is a major shift. And you mentioned earlier when you asked about this, what do you do with that? And I actually have a video on exactly that thing where we talk through this a little bit, but I think you got to be careful. If you're going through this and you're starting to learn these things, you got to be careful not to let the pendulum swing you so far that you go off the deep end. And I see a lot of people where that kind of happens. And so you got to have some way to meter yourself and, like we're saying, maybe step back, take some time, learn it, really go through it before you let it just turn your whole life upside down, right? Because it can do that. You can, I have one of my very best friends. I see him weekly, and we discuss the Bible all the time. But he is a futurist, still dispensational.
Sure.
And when I first started learning some of this stuff, we were watching a Christian video together, and I said something about, well, that didn't happen. That's not going to happen in the future. That's already. and he got mad.
Yeah.
I mean, and so it can do that. It can put a rift, and I think that rift is mainly caused by, that people grew up with that belief, just like I did. And you have someone poke a hole in it real quick like that, it really hurts, and you react. So, there are ways to do it and ways not to. And, sometimes it takes a little time to learn that.
No, I think that's so right. For me, I had a big shift in the understanding of predestination, soteriology, and it took me about 5 years to sort through all the issues. It's probably, Lord willing, hopefully it's the hardest issue I ever have to wrestle with. But I learned that pendulum that you're talking about. And so since then, for me, there's been many issues where I come back and I put my beliefs on the table. And I think, like you're saying, if that's the first major time this has happened, it's a really hard thing to go through. And it's really paradigm shifting. And so some crazy guy like me or like you that's always studying and researching, we probably go through these, every other week, right? Or something like that, where we have a change of view. Or I know for me sometimes.
You get more used to it, don't you? That, right, that blow, you're like, oh man, I had that so wrong,
Especially as a Bible teacher, because you're like, oh my gosh, how many times have I taught this in some way, shape, or form and misled people accidentally, right? But I think that's helpful to hear, and for me, it taught me to hold the essentials in a closed grip, tight hand, and everything else to kind of let it fly. However the scriptures lead, just try to follow them.
Yeah, and I think I have realized too since that time, and doing the videos and working with people online and discussing this stuff so much, is that we're all on a journey, and it's a long journey, and we're all at different points. So I've learned that when I interact with someone, my goal shouldn't be to make them understand what I understand or think that they need to know what I know. But my goal is, in personal interactions with people, to help them, if I can see a next level for them, to help them kind of break through a little bit. What's the next thing they need to know to kind of move forward? Even if it's, way back there on the road, as far as I'm concerned, man, I want to help them. And so that, I think, as Christians, what we really want to be doing right now is just helping each other make the next step in our journey. And we're all just trying to do the same thing, get closer to God. And so praise him. That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. No, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, David. That's really good. So, so you grew up with more kind of conservative Baptist background, kind of hopped around some different church experiences. Your father really poured into a love for a rigorous study of God's word, and then teaching with a group of teenage guys. Sounds like you started to have a few years ago some change in views, and that was kind of the second thing I wanted to talk to you about was what were you studying? Were you studying certain book of the Bible? You said you were teaching like a futurist view of, eschatology. What did you start to come across that you began to ask, maybe I missed something here in the Bible, or maybe, I'm not considering something. Was there like a particular linchpin or multiple linchpins for you that, really began to get the wheels turning?
Yeah, and when I tell you, you're going to be surprised, but
Okay.
I think you watched my video where I talk about this. But so I told you I had that kind of weird compulsion that I couldn't explain, but I knew was from God to read and read and read. Well, one day at my house, some Seventh-day Adventists stuck a copy of The Great Controversy in my mailbox.
Awesome.
And so I pull that thing out. I'm like, what is this? And I was like, oh, this is that SDA book. And I was like, I'm going to read it.
Sure.
Why not? I was like,
Sure.
I'll evaluate it. I didn't know. I didn't, you learn about different groups and their beliefs, but then you kind of forget. So I was like, I'll refresh. I want to know what they're trying to push here. So I started reading that thing. And man, if you've never read it, the first chapter is all about 70 AD.
Wow.
It is
Yeah.
all about it. It's about Josephus. It's about how, and it cross-references it with the Bible, and not just like one book. It's all over the Old Testament.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
cross-referencing the events, and it does a actually pretty good job. And it was enough that it opened my eyes, and I was like, wait a second, is this stuff sounds pretty legit. Like that really does match up a little bit. So what's going on? I mean, this just shook my tree, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, I gotta figure this out because this makes me wonder.
Sure.
And the question I started asking was, could the events of the first century leading up to and including the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, could it map to some of these prophecies? When I read through Daniel, is it plausible? That was the first question. Is it plausible that I can match these events up to some stuff that happened in the first century? So there was this, there's also that idea, when you're a futurist and a dispensational, you have that idea of this prophetic gap, right? There's the prophecy of Daniel 9, which includes the 70 weeks, right? And it's about 500 years worth of prophecy. Well, the futurist dispensational view is that up until a certain point, that's all fine, but then there's this break, and then we're still in this 2000, maybe 3, 4, who knows how many 1,000-year break before the end of that 500-year prophecy, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I knew from my background, I was like, I questioned that. It's like, that seems weird. Why would Daniel prophesy something that lasts from his time to the people he was prophesying it to for 490 years or so, or around that, and then break for 2,000 and then finish up? To me, that didn't make any sense. So I went to Daniel thinking, I'm going to look at this from the two things. One, does that gap make any sense with what Daniel says? And then number two, can I start to toy with the idea of these things happening in the first century, right? And so I had this vacation coming up, and I spent every waking moment where me and the kids or my wife weren't doing anything. I was in the Bible. I read through Daniel 9 and 12 and the surrounding text in Daniel, like, I don't know, 15 times or so.
Sure. Yeah.
Just
Right.
mapping it out and trying to see, like, could that have been? And the question in every case was, yes, it could have been. Yeah. And then I was like, maybe those SDA guys had something there. I don't know, but
you ever heard that God can use a crooked stick to draw a straight line? You ever heard that?
Yeah, and that's the thing.
Not to pick on Seventh-day Adventists, but yeah.
No, and it's even the cultists have some of it right, and I'm not necessarily even calling. I'm not even calling SDA a cult. I actually don't know that I would really categorize them that way.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not super familiar, but
I've read some esoteric and Kabbalistic texts that have some truth in them.
And what could you explain that really for me and the listeners? What's esoteric and what was the other word?
Kabbalistic. So Kabbalah is a Jewish mysticism religion that came out of Babylon, and it was a mix of Babylonian and Zoroastrianism from Persia.
Okay.
And it grew into a kind of a Jewish mysticism that has survived till the present day. We even have some people in the entertainment industry that are Kabbalists. And it is a it is a way essentially of tapping into the spirit world in a very dark way that you don't want to do.
Kind of cultistic type stuff.
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
cool.
And so all I'm saying is, they have some things right, but they're not doing the right thing. So we have to understand that a lot of people, there's sources of truth in a lot of different places.
Sure.
And we can't be so high and mighty to think that, well, if the SDA group has some things wrong, then they have everything wrong. That's not a very valid
It's a bad
argument.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where I stand on that. But this journey I took on that vacation, reading through Daniel and mapping it at the first century, is really what started me. After that, I was like, I don't really have any questions about Daniel 9 anymore. I just explained everything to myself.
It all makes sense now, right?
Yeah. Whereas before it was like, it was more than half question marks and, antichrists and abominations and things. And that's just not the case. After that, I was like, man, I really got to figure all this out because this thing's real.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah. So for me, I'm going to take this screen to Daniel 7 real quick. I'd love to unpack two of these things. I'd love to unpack the kingdom of God as prophesied of coming from the final beast in Daniel chapter 7, verse 23. And those, I think through verse 27. I'd love to talk through that. And then after that, maybe talk a little bit about the 70 weeks prophecy. But for me, I'm of course, I'm just now finishing up teaching through Mark. And when I got to the Olivet Discourse, which I want to bring up and ask you one question about a section of verses there. There's so much we could talk about. I won't hold you for 10 hours to walk through that whole thing with you. But what was interesting is I get to comparing the Gospels, right? So I'm studying, teaching through Mark, trying to stay in there, but also referencing Matthew and Luke because they sometimes add additional details. And I get to a certain part where Luke is saying that Jesus tells them to go understand the prophecies of Daniel, right? And Mark doesn't record that. Mark's gospel is the shortest. And so I'm like, well, what does Daniel have to do with this? So I've always stayed super far away from eschatology. I was so busy studying soteriology, or the study of predestination salvation, for years that I knew it needed attention, but I just knew that I didn't have the time or the energy. It was going elsewhere. So after I've kind of sorted through that, I'm like, okay, maybe it's time for me to start dealing with some of these issues, especially since I'm teaching through Mark and I kind of need to, right? And so I got to kind of that section. And yeah, so back to what you were saying, I started to see like we get to Daniel and everyone, I like to joke around and say, is running to their proverbial end times charts, and they're like, well, it means this. And this other guy, well, it means this, right? And it's just all over the map. And so I'm just like, what is going on here? This is the most allegorized, construed text. It's got to mean something objectively, right? And I see like 20,000 different interpretations. So that got me studying Daniel, which led me to record all those videos of overviewing, Daniel's prophecies, chapters 7 through 12. And then, which I stumbled across your content. And as we've talked before, Bruce Gore and some other different Bible teachers on YouTube. And then finally, after that, I came back to the Olivet Discourse and taught through that. But I'd love to talk to you, David, about this final beast that, according to Daniel chapter 7, which I'll pull up here on my screen so everyone can see. But my understanding, I'd love to share a little bit and then hear your thoughts and let you speak on this. But what I read over and over when I was studying through Daniel, and again, all that content's on my channel if you're looking for that on a playlist. But the way I understood it is we have four beasts. We have this first beast, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, you might need to help me out here, but we have a lion with wings, which is describing in the dream, symbolically, the Babylonian Empire. And then secondly, we have this bear with three ribs in its mouth, which is three ribs, many scholars would say, is symbolizing the three kingdoms that gobbled up to form what's known as Medo-Persia for the second kingdom. And then this third beast, of course, Daniel's living in the time of the first beast, and then the rest of the beasts are future prophecy for Daniel back in his day. And then the third beast is this four-headed leopard, which we now know looking back symbolizes Greece, and There's other prophecies concerning the ram and the goat, which we look back to see as Alexander the Great. And then there's this fourth terrible beast with seven, is it seven horns? 10 heads, 7 horns? Is that right?
I'll have to look here.
It's a dragon.
Let's see. Yeah, there's lots of horns.
Yeah, horns. It's just like this
10
phenomenal
horns,
beast.
it says.
10 horns, okay.
In verse 7. 10 horns. Another little horn came up, or among those 10 was a little horn. And yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, so that's where we are. Sure.
So the fourth beast is this thing, and again, Revelation describes the beast of Revelation is described identically to the beast of Daniel, which is just an interesting note. We'll leave that alone, but it's described the same way. It's 10 horns and 10 kings. But anyways, the verse that really stuck out to me when I was studying Daniel is this. If you'd like, I'll just read this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on all this. I know I've been rambling for a little bit. So, chapter 7:23, it says, "This is what he told me," and this is the interpretation of the dream from the angel. "This is what he told me. The fourth beast means that there will be a fourth kingdom on earth." Again, Daniel's living in the first kingdom for our listeners. That will differ from all the other kingdoms. It will devour all the earth and will trample and crush it. So it's unique in that this world empire will really span the whole known earth at the time. Verse 24, "The 10 horns mean that the 10 kings will arise from that kingdom. Another king will arise after them, but he will be different from the earlier ones. He will humiliate 3 kings. He will speak words against the Most High," which we take to mean as God. "And then he will harass the holy ones of the Most High," which could mean angels or people, but given the context, seems to be people because they're living on the earth. "He will harass the holy ones of the Most High continually. His intention will be to change times established by law. They will be delivered into his hand for a time, times, and half a time." So in just a second, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But there's the year, 2 years, and then half a year. Many take that to be a 3.5-year period. And he says, "But the court will convene, and his ruling authority will be removed, destroyed, and abolished forever." And then the last verse, 27, "Then the kingdom, authority, and greatness of all the kingdoms, of the kingdoms under all of heaven will be delivered to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. All authorities will serve him and obey him." And so for me, the way I clearly understand it, it's okay, there's some eternal kingdom that's supposed to arise out of this fourth beast. And I'm like, if we don't interpret this as the kingdom of God, as Jesus' first preaching message, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," if we don't take it as that, what in the world would this be talking about? So anyways, I'll be quiet and let you talk, David, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I can't answer that question because to me, that's definitely what we are talking about here. That fourth beast, and the Roman Empire did exactly this. It devoured all other kingdoms, and it went through the entire known world of, the Middle East that we know today, and it just took them all over and devoured it, broke it into pieces. And the breaking into pieces is also relevant because it was also kind of fragmented at the same time. Once it scattered over everything and they conquered, they had these kind of like, what do you call them, precincts or something. And there were a lot of civil wars, especially in the first century.
That's right.
And different factions rising up. And so it was strong and covered everything, but then also became fragmented. And so then, the 10 horns are obviously the 10 Caesars. A horn, by the way, in prophecy, almost always referring to an authority figure. So that's just the symbol that is always used for that. And then it's talking about this little horn, and in the way that our English reads, it sounds like it's coming out like there's another horn, an 11th, but it's not. It's one of the 10 horns is the little horn. It's from among them is what it's really saying.
Awesome.
And so when we count the first 10 Caesars, and then who's the one that is right in the middle is Nero. And he is blaspheming God. And if you know much about his history, he was just in fact, he had the nickname the Beast.
Yeah. And
because of
yeah,
the things, the atrocities he would do. And he would also apparently get half naked and run around the Coliseum arena like an animal
yeah,
and do weird things. I mean, he was out
yeah,
there, man.
to say the least.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so it's just amazing when you know the history, how this matches so well. And I believe the time and half a time is the 3.5 years leading up to the destruction of the temple. I truly believe that if there is a time period that is called the Great Tribulation, that's it.
Mm.
Because Nero was persecuting the Christians. They were not only Christians, but Jews were being slaughtered. It was horrific and
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
And then that ends, and God consummates it. He brings it to an end in the judgment of the temple, and all of it is destroyed. The judgment of the temple actually happening on the day of a feast of Saturn,
Yeah.
if you can
Right.
believe that.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like a slap in the face to the gods of Rome that now there's a new authority in town, and it's Jesus Christ. He has now inherited all of the nations of the earth. And so this, and you know, the things I'm saying, some of them are far reaching. We could go into tons of text to talk about, but this just matches so well. And you know, he gives Christ the dominion at that point, you know, and the saints, I believe you're right, that's the people.
Yeah. The holy
They
ones of the Most High. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Sure.
And this everlasting kingdom was established at that time. It's the one that Daniel was talking about. You know,
Yeah.
if Daniel had made that prophecy and this had not been the kingdom, then there's no way for us to know when that will ever come or if. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. And that, by the way, a prophecy that
That's good.
spanned 3,000 years would not have made any sense or helped Daniel or Nebuchadnezzar at all,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
That would have been irrelevant to them.
Yeah.
So for us to think from their perspective, that they're getting this prophecy that half of it won't be fulfilled in any regards to them and have nothing to do with them, that's kind of a silly notion. You know, of course, I'm looking back on it. When I held that belief, I didn't think it was silly, but it's kind
Sure.
of silly.
Right. Yeah. Once we
And
hear the other
so,
side and yeah, some more of this stuff.
yeah, just some common sense comes into play there. You know, God gave this to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel for a reason. And I think the reason I'm saying Nebuchadnezzar is because if we jump back to chapter 2 and we have that
Yep.
statue, right?
It's
It's
right
the
there.
same kingdoms. It's the
Mhm.
exact, it's a mirror of this one in Daniel 7. It's the same prophecy, really.
Yeah.
There's the gold head, the silver arms and torso, the bronze and the iron, that's Rome, and the iron mixed with clay in the toes. That's the fragmented nature of the kingdom of Rome right before 70 AD. It started out strong, but it got weak towards the end.
Yeah.
And then Christ came in and did everything, right? And so it really matches up nicely when you start to understand this
Yeah,
stuff.
I wanted to bring this up and hear your thoughts on this, David, because I'm sure, man, I would guess that 99% of people that would even watch this video are all coming from a futurist perspective. I've really not met many people. I've got a few seminary buddies that they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I don't see Revelation as future, and they've just exhaustively studied the scriptures. But we both know that, the mainstream idea in good Christian Bible believing people is something totally different, right, than what we're saying today. But I want to get your thoughts on this, on a couple things. But the first thing I'd like to bring up is one of the things that was really challenging for me, particularly studying the Daniel prophecies, and like you said, chapter 2 and 7 through 12, because they're all talking about the same thing. But
Right.
one of the things that was challenging is, okay, if we're holding to a future world empire, world government, a fourth beast, right, if you will, what in the world, like Rome, everyone would agree the first one's Babylon. Everyone would agree the second one, for the most part, is Medo-Persia. Everyone would agree unanimously that Greece is the third world empire. That's not really debated. I was actually surprised that it's not. When I was researching it, I found just about unanimous consensus here. And then everyone projects the fourth beast. And I'm like, okay, Rome was the biggest world empire that's ever existed in human history. And are we just to say that just drop it, like it doesn't come up anywhere, I mean, that for me was one of the harder things with Daniel and trying to twist everything to future, is that we have to discount the greatest and largest world empire that's ever existed. And to say that, discount it in the sense that, okay, all these other world empires are being spoken of, but oh yeah, Rome, yeah, the Bible doesn't have anything to say about that. It just skips over Rome.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and the way I heard that growing up was that Rome was a great empire, and it did match. And that's what I was taught.
Okay.
It did match that fourth kingdom, but they would say it never really ended, and it still exists it's a different form now, though. Like,
Okay.
today it's the European Union and all this different stuff. Well, what's funny now is they were saying European Union like 10 years ago, and that was the final kingdom. It was all coming, and now it's all getting broken up, It's
Yeah.
but so that's how I was told, which is interesting, because you
That's
said you were told that wasn't the final kingdom, but that was what I was taught. It was, but it's just ongoing. Like, it lasts however many thousand years till the end of this gap, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, those were a couple of things. I thought that part was particularly challenging to just, I guess, to discount Rome altogether. And then I guess along with it is this language we find in verse 27 of Daniel chapter 7 of this eternal kingdom that is to arrive from the fourth beast. And I feel like you almost have to start chopping up your New Testament to really remove this idea of the kingdom of heaven being established on earth. And, the part where Jesus ascends into heaven and says, hey, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. You have to cut that out. I mean, and I people wouldn't cut it out, conservative Bible believers, but with their understanding, you have to almost chop it up and fragment everything and say, well, he didn't really mean,
Well, and that's what you find a lot, right? Is we find that people will pull the verses that they find in the New Testament, that if you take them and you don't pull their whole context, then you can kind of make it sound like that's supporting the view, right? And that
right.
We've all done that.
Sure.
I will admit. But the correct way is to really examine the context and see if it allows you, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Access to that,
or leads you to do that, right?
And we just have to be super careful. I try to do that, but we're not perfect. But the better we can be at that and use the context of these passages and be super careful about context, the audience, and the time frame it was written, we're gonna do a lot better.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think context is king for sure.
Yeah.
So let's jump on to, unless there's anything else you have to throw in about Daniel 7, I'd love to jump to the 70 weeks prophecy, if that's cool with you.
Sure, yeah.
Daniel 9:24, so through 20:27. So this is probably, I would say, one of the most challenging, at least in the Old Testament prophecies, to interpret. But on this passage, I'd love to, we could talk forever about that. I don't want to do that to you or to our listeners, but I'd love to talk about the timestampness of the prophecy here. And then for me, in my understanding, the few things that are in here that aren't linked to time necessarily. So in short, the way I understand it is we have this clear 77s or 70 weeks or 70 Shabuas, however you would say it. These 77s, you have it linked. It's all linked in time. It's clearly a prophecy that is time dependent. It's made in time. It's made to begin in time and to end in time. It's not arbitrary, and I don't know that it could really be stretched out unless God brought us further revelation, kind of like when we get here with Jeremiah. Right, in the prophecies of Jeremiah, there's 70 years, and Daniel's reading this in the book of Daniel, and Daniel understands that the 70 years is coming to an end, so he begins to pray, and then God says, no, I'm going to extend that. But it's recorded scripture, so if we had another revelation from God, that extended that, maybe we could, have some justification, but that never happened, right? There is no Daniel 2 or book 2 or, whatever. But I'd love to talk about that because in my understanding of this 70 weeks prophecy, it's that most of it is stamped in time. The only section of this that I would say is not linked to that, I guess what it would be 400 90 something years. It's been a while. 493, I believe, is the 69, and then something like that. But anyways, it's the part of the destruction of the temple. And the way I understand it is all that was time-stamped was fulfilled, except for maybe the exception of the destruction of the temple that was to be built, the third temple. And then when Jesus shows up as the anointed one, as the one who was prophesied, then when he shows up, he predicts in his lifetime with the Olivet Discourse the rest of Daniel's prophecy that wasn't fulfilled, which is that of the destruction of the temple. So anyways, you could agree or disagree or whatever. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the...
No, I think if I'm understanding what you said correctly, that I agree with that. So the interesting things here for me when I finally started to understand this passage was we have to realize first that it talks about the 70 weeks in verse 24. And then in verse 26, it talks about 62 weeks.
Yep, 62 weeks.
Or in verse 25, the 7 weeks, the 60, and the 2 weeks. That's 69 weeks. So
Right.
All but one, right? And so it's all about this 69-week period, really.
Sure.
And so, I can't remember which scholar, was it Usher or one of these guys that did that mathematics and figured that from the giving of this prophecy to about the time of the end of this 490-year period was literally the day almost that Jesus walked into the temple and they were waving the palm branches, right?
Yeah, so there's two places people either date. I'm agnostic on this issue. I'm really not sure. I haven't had the time for the research, but people either date it with the very event that you mentioned when it's called the triumphal entry of Christ on the back of a donkey or foal. The only other place I've seen people date it is at his baptism, but with John the Baptist. But that's the only two. But that's where everyone. Yeah.
And to me, either one works fine. Doesn't affect the prophecy at all. Now, the thing that's interesting is that I still actually do believe there's a gap between that 69 weeks or 460. Whatever I said. What did I say?
490, something like that. Whatever 70 times
the final week not being accounted for in this passage, right? And so I do believe there's a break. There's a gap. And that 40-year gap is the 40 years between Jesus' ascension and essentially 70 AD. I believe, and some people differ on this, and I'm not going to come down hard, but I truly believe that the last week is the 3.5 years before and the 3.5 years after 70 AD, destruction of the temple. And that's because the 70 weeks, it says in verse 24, are determined for the holy people and the holy city to finish their transgression and make an end of their sins.
Yeah.
And if you know what happened in the first 3.5 years before 70 AD is the tribulation period. They were really persecuted during that time.
Right.
And then the second one, right after that, what happened exactly 3.5 years after the temple being destroyed? Do you know that in history?
I don't know. I know
the Romans They chased the rest of the Jewish zealots up to Masada, the mountain fortress of Masada, and exactly 3.5 years after they finished them off. Done.
Yeah, I've been there. I actually got the opportunity to go there, and we talked through how they killed themselves. They killed their families. It was a mass suicide, and then you can actually still to this day. I probably showed it in a video somewhere, hopefully, but you can see the ramp that the Romans built. To conquer it. They had such a hard time. It's an interesting war story. It really is how they went about starving them out but that's what I thought. I wasn't as sure, but it lines up.
There's all that. And then the other thing I think about this passage I just want to mention before we move on is when I realized that most people see this phrase in verse 26, the people of the prince that shall come, which I think is correctly identified. And I wouldn't call it the Antichrist, but the beast. It's the beast from the New Testament, from Revelation.
Yeah.
And the problem is that people use that prepositional phrase, the subject of that prepositional phrase, and use it in the next part, which it says, he shall confirm the covenant for 1 week. They think the beast is going to do those things, but that's not what's being said. The subject in all of this, starting from verse 25, is the Messiah, the Prince.
Yeah, right.
And so when I realized that, and that, wow, then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off, and the people of the prince, the beast, will come and destroy the city. That's fine. The people of the Roman soldiers did that.
Yeah.
And the end will be with the flood, desolations, and he will confirm the covenant. Well, that's still Jesus, because he's still the subject.
Yeah, that's right.
He will confirm the covenant for many with 1 week, for 1 week, and in the midst he will cause it to cease. That's 70 AD. There's no
Gotcha.
more after 70 because the temple is gone. And so when I saw that, I was like, wow, okay. So before I thought that this was the Antichrist, and that's what everyone always taught me.
Right.
Well, it's he's going to be the world leader. He's going to have been wounded and come back to life, and he's going to make a covenant with Israel for a week, and then in the middle he's going to break it. Right? That's all the future is teaching.
Right.
But this is God's doing. This is not the beast doing.
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
So that was another thing. When I saw that and realized it, I was like, man, now this is making some sense, right?
Yeah.
Because who ends the covenant? Who ends the covenant in 70 AD? God puts an end to the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant.
Yeah.
It no longer is in force. The Jews are confused nowadays. The modern Jews, they're all confused.
Yeah.
And they're it's just, to me, that became so clear and helped me so much with this passage. So,
yeah. And I'd love to bounce this off. You don't have to agree with this, but the other side of this that I've heard is that if you date the 70th week starting at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and again, I'm not super familiar with timetables, so forgive me, but then his 3.5 year ministry or 3 year ministry would be the first half of that 70th week. And then after some people would date the covenant being brought to an end at the crucifixion. And then that last of that 3.5 years would be him. So throughout the entire 1 week, so like getting specific with the verses, verse 24, 70 weeks have been determined to put an end to rebellion, bring sin to completion, atone for iniquity, bring in perpetual righteousness, seal up prophetic vision. So many would say the 70 weeks is in the lifetime of the Messiah. And I'm not saying this to argue. I'm saying so that people listening, that one of the two ways really that people interpret this, one of it is like in the lifetime of Jesus, and one is within the destruction of the temple. But they would say that like it ended with the crucifixion. And then you have the verse 25 prophecy of the destruction of the temple. And then, the second temple. And then this is really meaty text here. And then for the verse 27, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, would date that from the beginning of his ministry to then after the 3 years following his death and resurrection, with because it's Jerusalem that is in the mind of Daniel. The prophecy is concerning Jerusalem. And if you remember the teaching of Jesus, it's that they were first to go to Jerusalem and then to Judea and the rest of the world, right? And so the apostles, many would line up the book of Acts starting with Paul's vision and like conversion and sending out to the Gentiles right at the end of 3.5 years after the death of Jesus. So again, I don't know. I haven't done the volumes of research I need to do to come down on positions on all these things, but I thought it was another interesting idea that, maybe, of course, as Hebrews tells us, Jesus' death ends that covenant. But we at least, whether it's ended at the crucifixion or at the temple, it ended one of the two places, for me, in my understanding, and to try and stretch it out, I think just mars this text, it just you almost have to, I don't know. It's like a free for all, like at least, try to tie it to the verses somehow, but people just end up stretching it out to who knows where, so.
Yeah, no, to me, again, that some inordinate amount of time slammed in here, to me, destroys the validity of it, and the usefulness of the prophecy. what use is it to Daniel or anyone? And he was told at the end of this book, seal it up. So let's say he sealed it up, and that was held by the Jews and not opened until closer to when Christ came. Well, if they then opened it and found, oh, wait, there's 2,000 years left to go, what would that have meant to them? Like, that's useless, right? There's nothing there for them. So, I think you're right. I think you're right on that. We have to be very, just use some common sense and come to it with new eyes, I think too helps.
Yeah. And another thing I was thinking of is it's interesting that the ending of Daniel, and we'll close out this section talking about Daniel, but the ending of Daniel, there's a certain part of that same story that the angel is describing them in visions and interpreting for Daniel that he says, nope, this last part, seal it up. Seal it up. Don't tell them. And then we get to the book of Revelation. Revelation in Greek, it's the apocalypse. It means the unveiling, the revealing, right? And we get to it, and it's like, here it is. Go tell the world. Don't keep it to yourself.
That's right. Don't seal it.
Yeah, and for me, it's like after I've read through Daniel and exhaustively studied it, and then read through the Olivet Discourse and exhaustively studied that, I haven't exhaustively studied Revelation. I've been dabbling in it, reading it multiple times and all that, and I'm not that comfortable with it yet, but I can't stop thinking about Daniel. I'm like, man, all this stuff. I mean, it's if you know Daniel and know it well, I don't know how I'd have to turn my brain off to read Revelation and not see all of this in there,
Oh yeah.
So.
Well, you're in the same place I was. It's like I did the same thing after I had beat Daniel to death on that vacation that I took. Then I was like, at some point I was like in the back of my head, oh boy, at some point I got to touch Revelation here. That's going to be tough. I knew it, but it's but I think, coming at Revelation with that understanding in your mind, it's got to be forefront of your mind is like the people reading this needed it at that time.
Yeah, that's right.
So why did they need this? And so when you're reading it, it's like, how does this help them understand what was happening? Because they were in the middle of it, right? So that is very important when you go to Revelation.
Yeah, I would love to do like a parody of Revelation and interpret it by saying, and opening the beginning and say to the 7 cities in 21st century North America, but that's not, you're right. That's not how it's introduced. But anyways,
No.
I'd love to talk to you briefly about these 2 rapture passages. And we're kind of already talking about proof text theology. Before we jump into, first I'd love to jump into 2 Thessalonians. You actually probably may have to help me out on this, David, and you probably know the passage references way better than I do. I know the ones in 2 Thessalonians chapter 4, but before we talk through 2 Thessalonians, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I call it proof text theology. And when I say that, and I've done a couple of short videos on this, I remember doing a video and I quoted Psalm 2 where God says he hates all those who do iniquity. And I said, and I quoted John 3:16. I said, you can't just pick and choose a Bible verse and run with it and let that interpret how you see the entire world. That's not how the Bible's meant to be read. You could just as easily as we would quote John 3:16 and say, well, God loves everyone. We could quote another random verse in the Bible and say, well, God actually hates everyone. It's just not the way to go about, trying to understand who God is. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about systematic theology. I love it, but I think it's got to be careful. I'd rather prefer doing biblical theology where we're just reading through and extracting from the text. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is proof text theology? Why does it get us into trouble? What's the danger with just picking and choosing Bible verses to fit whatever we think's right?
Right. Well, I think in using the term proof text theology, you're using a seminary term that I'm less familiar with. But I think I
think it's
understand
actually my own made-up term.
Is it?
Yeah, it's not something I learned in seminary.
But I just think, we have touched on it a little bit, but I grew up with pastors that would open the Bible and read 2 verses and then talk about it for the next 45 minutes, right? And
oh boy.
Not bring any more references to support what they were saying. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It's like, taken out of context, I can say that there is none righteous,
no, not one. And that sounds good, but in context, that is a passage in Romans that's talking about the Jews and their obedience to the law.
Yeah.
And not that it's not relevant, but it's not, I can't just take that verse and say, nobody ever throughout history ever has been righteous or done anything righteous ever, or anything good. And so we have to be careful. We have to know the context. You know, one of the things I started trying to do with people is when they debate me on a topic or bring a question, I always try to give them the references and the support for it. And this is what I think we should all do as brothers and sisters when we're talking together, is stop answering each other from the back pocket. Like, what's the last thing I remember learning? Instead, let's take 5 minutes, go find where we think it is, make sure the context supports what we're talking about, and then deliver the source for what we really believe. And be honest about that. You know, it's just not an easy thing. I think that we grow up in a culture that allows for that. And so we get sloppy. And it's easy to be sloppy. So
yeah, I was listening to a podcast while I was cutting the grass the other day. It was something Bailey, the president of Dallas Theological Seminary, and he was being interviewed. I watched one with Sam Smith being interviewed about amillennialism, and then another one with something Bailey. I can't remember his first name, but he's the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. And he was giving his view, and he was accusing like amillennialists of not believing in the Bible literally and all this just blatant accusations. And then one of the things he said was just that, like, he was just proof texting the mess out of his view, but he wasn't explaining any of it like you're talking about. He's just like, this for like Galatians chapter this and Daniel chapter this. And like, he didn't explain any of it. And that's so common, like you're saying. And for me, I was frustrated. I remember yelling while I was cutting the grass. I wasn't yelling like angry, but I was like, no, but I get so frustrated because like for the average person listening who's a Christian that doesn't know their Bible well, they're just going to say, well, because this guy just pulled a bunch of back pocket verses out, he's got to know identically what they mean. And because he didn't say so, there's probably not a different interpretation of this. So we better just believe whatever he tells us, it's straight from the Bible, because he just quoted these random verses. So therefore that's, you see what I'm saying?
It takes this takes us into another discussion. And that is that we tend as a society to really get on the appeal to authority bandwagon.
Yeah.
And so because that man said it, do you think what percentage of the listeners do you think looked up each of those verses he quoted?
0%.
So
yeah.
But because like you said, he's an authority, we tend to immediately give validity even where it may not be warranted. And I go into this quite a bit in my videos as I'm studying through things, and I talk about the different people throughout history, Christians, some of them great Christians.
Sure.
But I encourage people, realize that great Christian could have been you. I mean, you're a man just like that person, so he has no more standing before God than you do.
Yeah,
as far as what you believe and your responsibility level. We as humans were created not to beholden to each other, but to behold to him. And so it's like we're all on the same playing field. Yeah. And yes, some men, I do admire a man who spent his life in the study of the scriptures, and I do highly regard that. But at the same time, like you heard in that podcast, when someone's throwing scriptures out, rapid fire, I'm like, and actually, no matter what a person says, no matter their standing, if it rings a bell and I don't know if it's true or not, I will vet it against the scriptures.
Yeah, and I think that's not common. Yeah, it's not. Common.
Yeah, maybe that's the thing. It's like we don't. It takes some work. So that I think is part of it too. It takes some work. It's not easy, and to constantly question and be skeptical.
Yeah, and vet everything.
Maybe it takes a jerk like me. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I feel that way sometimes, but I do vet everything I don't let people get away with that kind of rapid fire. There's this, and this, and you don't know what you're talking about. Well, let's examine those things, right? Let's not just. So I think you're right. I think, a level of carefulness, consideration, and the willingness to put some effort into making sure we know what people are talking about,
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I love the way I do my channel. It's the same way that you do your channel. When you're presenting something on YouTube, a lot of times you're showing people, while you're doing it. It's like, look, it's not just me trying to throw this at you and could trick you into believing it. Like, no, like read it for yourself right here on the screen beside me. And that's one of the things I love about your YouTube channel. It's like, you're trying to just present things and you do it well, and I think people that should be skeptical and should be inquisitive and should be checking everything, like Bereans, right? They're searching the scriptures to see if whatever was said it lines up with scripture. It's just not common enough,
Yeah, I hear you.
Cool. So I'd love to dive into 1 Thessalonians chapter 4.
Let's see.
And then there's one more verse. You're going to have to help me out. I don't know where it's at, but there's another, I think, section. I think it's 1 Corinthians that speaks to people usually reference for the rapture.
I think I was looking for it earlier, and I knew there was two, but I was having trouble finding.
I
found the First Thessalonian ones, but
well, that's okay. I mean, we could just talk through 1 Thessalonians 4. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe I could see if I can find that other one.
Yeah, so 1 Thessalonians 4, verses, let's see.
Like 13.
13 following to 18, it looks like. We have to understand, again, its context is important. So This is a letter Paul wrote to the Thessalonican church, right? So these are Christians in the first century, in the midst of the trials and tribulation type stuff. They were getting persecuted, Romans this and Jews hated, all this stuff going on.
Yeah.
So in that context, they were getting upset because they didn't know if when the Lord was talking about coming back and the kingdom starting, if their dead loved ones were going to be taken. They were worried that their dead loved ones would not be with them after they died. Like they wouldn't see them again. This is truly what they were worried about. So verse 18 tells us, it says, wherefore comfort one another with these. They were looking for comfort.
Yeah, right.
For Paul, for the situations they were in, right? It wasn't just some random thing. This is what it was about. So he says, don't worry. He's like, don't worry.
Yeah.
Even those that sleep in Jesus, God will bring with him. Verse 14, right?
Yeah.
So he's telling them, your loved ones, your dad who died the other day, he's going to be there. It's going to be okay. So this is comforting for them. He says that we who are alive and remain until the coming that we've been telling you about will not go before those that are asleep. So at the coming, the asleep ones, the dead ones, were going to go. He was giving them this to comfort them. Don't worry, they're not going to stay in Hades. They're not going to be dead forever. They're going to go when this kingdom comes. And then in the verse 17, which is the one, verse 16 says, the Lord will descend from heaven, the voice of the archangel, the trump, the dead in Christ will rise first, just as he just told them. And then in verse 17 is where everyone gets hung up. Then we which are alive and remain will be caught up together, harpazo, with them in the clouds, right? Mm-hmm. So everyone who believes in a rapture sees this verse and says, that means that the people who are alive, he was telling them they're going to fly up there.
Yeah, right.
Well, we got to be careful. And this is where this is hard. And it's hard for me to tell other people because you really do need, I hate to say, a little Greek understanding goes a long way with this verse.
Yeah.
Number one, harpazo, caught up, doesn't mean rapture. It means just taken away.
Right.
It's ambiguous. It's not talking about, humans flying up in the sky. It just means you'd be taken, okay? Taken together. And the word that starts that verse, then, in English, we have a very immediate sense of that word. Like then, that means right after, boom, boom. That's what we always think. But that word in Greek really, if I had to translate it, I would translate it afterwards.
Right. So that word
And
comes up all the
can,
time in Mark's gospel. That's how he transitions.
and sometimes they translate it hereafter, which I think would have been better in this case.
Yeah.
But that word, if you look it up and all the uses, it means everything from like a 1 day period to a dozens of years period.
Yeah.
It is functional in the language in regards to all those different time frames. So it generally is a very ambiguous word. It means afterwards, at some point,
Yeah.
and the point at which you will be caught up together with them because they were resurrected is when you die and you are taken up. That's what it's talking about here. And why does that comfort? We have to, again, analyze it from the perspective of the context. Why does that comfort them? Because then they're going to be together with their loved ones.
Yeah, that's right.
They're going to be together with them. This is not telling them that, you know, if you're standing on the ground, when Jesus comes in those clouds, zoop, you get to fly. No, sorry. It's not really it. And what is the one thing, by the way, this is another, and it's all about context.
Yeah, sure.
But I've read a ton of old Jewish writings, rabbis and Talmud, Midrash, all this stuff. What is the thing that the Jews were always looking for, that where people would rise up? It was the resurrection. And that is a resurrection of the dead. It's not a resurrection of the living. You can't be resurrected if you're alive. This was the resurrection that the Jews had always talked about. And of course, the Jews, not accepting Christ, getting all bitter about the Messiah who wasn't going to give them an earthly kingdom and win the earth for them and take over the Roman Empire. They were bitter and they didn't like Christ and they didn't recognize this resurrection, but it was occurring. Yeah. The Sadducees, by the way, you'll read about them, they denied a resurrection. And this was the event that the Jews were talking about for centuries.
Right. Yeah. And the Pharisees believed in it, so they would have been looking forward to that event.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like you said, context is so key. It's so common for so many of our beliefs. We find a single verse in the Bible that supports whatever in the world we're trying to prove. And then it's just, here it is, you know.
Yeah,
we quote it like that's the end all be all.
Exactly. And to me, the hard part to talk to futurists about when they are pointing at this passage and yelling at me, see, there's the rapture right there. And I mean, I look at them and I say this, but they don't hear me.
Yeah.
I say, if this is, just think about, this is your best proof for a rapture, this verse right here, and your only proof. If you consider it a proof, does that tell you something? You know, to me, that tells me something. If I have something that I think is true, but then I can only find one thing in one place that tells me that thing, then I really start to double down on whether I really understand what it's saying. I don't then question everything else and say, well, now my belief about this one thing is right because I found a verse. No. Yeah. You need to understand the verse and make sure. Most of the things that I believe, I try to source multiple times from multiple places. That's what gives me a confidence that what I'm saying is more right. Yeah,
that's right. No, and so many like essential doctrines are repeated over and over. Salvation by grace through faith and the deity of Christ, things like this. I mean, you'll find it over and over and over and over. And like you're saying, a lot of our things that we create our own theologies from single verses, sometimes it's not anywhere else. And you get to looking at the context, or read the chapter before and the chapter after, and it's like, I don't know if that's actually what he's talking about in that single verse, you know?
Yeah. Again, it's that carefulness and that willingness to push yourself, you know, to make sure. To me, I don't know how it happens with other people, but I have question marks that start popping up. And so I have to, if I haven't resolved all those question marks, each one individually, then I feel like I haven't fully vetted it. And so as long as I've got a question mark that I feel like is not satisfactorily vetted, I'm not going to tell someone I know for sure, you know, on that.
That's the same way I teach. Yeah. I read through it and then I study through it until like every nook and cranny, I feel like, you know, I'm pretty sure that this is what this is talking about. And then I check it with the context before and after. And I think that's a good way to go about. But if you come with an agenda to the text, then things are going to say whatever you want them to say, you know?
And it's hard. I mean,
Yeah.
man,
People don't
and
know they're bringing an
I've done
agenda,
that.
you know?
I mean,
You don't
we've done
know.
that so many times. It's
Yeah,
hard to
me
know.
too. Yeah.
You got to be real self introspective to be able to know when you're doing that, And I think I'm pretty practiced at it, but I probably have blind spots too.
Sure.
Everybody does, but
all.
we just do the best we can and keep working at it. I think we're all working on the same things, just a matter of getting there.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. Yeah, I think everyone does do this, and yeah, I think the fight for being a faithful Bible interpreter is, yeah, like you said, to keep asking questions, and not that we don't come to a conclusion eventually. I think we do, but just because someone somewhere or everyone in your generation says, well, this means that, I think it's helpful studying a little church history, or even just listening to others. Does a faithful Bible teacher that I know of, do any of them have a different view of this, and then hear it out, because not everyone should be weighed equally as Bible teachers, but, because sometimes and I'm sure you have guys that you would listen to or read that you say, well, both of these guys are faithful Bible teachers, interpreters, but they line up very differently on certain things. And then those are the guys you try to listen to both sides on that thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, for this conversation, when I was studying John MacArthur's hardcore, clear predispensationalist, and then I look in his same camp, right, with someone like R.C. Sproul, and R.C. Sproul's like, well, clearly it doesn't mean, what everyone's saying it means,
Yeah.
So anyways, I think that's helpful. Cool. So I'd love to talk to you about, if you can think of the other Rapture passage that's used, I'd love to go there. But if not, I'd love to skip ahead to the Olivet Discourse and talk about, there's one passage in particular I'd love to walk through.
Sure, let's do it. Yeah.
So it is Mark 13. And again, forgive me, I'm just in Mark's gospel because that's where I've been the past month or two.
Yeah.
So this is also, for our listeners, this is also in, correct me if I'm wrong, David, Luke 21 and Matthew 24. Do you know that off the top of your head?
That's correct. Yes.
All right. 1 point.
I didn't know it off the top of my head, but I would have gotten close.
Yeah.
But it's on the screen in the Bible Hub thing I'm using. So.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, Luke 21, the same passage. So the passage in particular, so for me, when I was studying this passage, it took me 2 weeks, and I did release a video. It's over 2 hours long, excuse me. Maybe it is 2 hours wrong because no one's going to listen to it. But,
Nah.
but for me, this was the real sticking point. So this is what ultimately shifted my mind. The first thing that changed my mind was when I get to the part where Jesus says, I assure you, he says, amen, I tell you, truly I tell you, like when Jesus says amen about something, he's putting it in the most blatant, blunt terms. That's like if I was telling my wife or a friend something like, look, trust me, like if I was saying it, you're going to put it the clearest way you know how. And so when Jesus says, amen, I tell you, in verse 30, and my NET's got it translated, I tell you the truth, but he's saying amen there. Amen, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. I'm thinking, for this to be a verse where Jesus says, truly, I tell you, we take a word, generation, that's always meant everywhere else where it's used in the Bible to mean something, and we make it mean something else right after Jesus said, like as bluntly as he can, look, I'm telling you the real deal. I'm telling you the truth, So for me, that didn't sit well. I'm like, can we really twist this? Should we really be twisting this to mean something else? And then I think the ultimate thing, so that was what really got me questioning. And then what really changed my mind was verse 24 through 27, this phrasing, in those days after that suffering or tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will be falling from heaven. The powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then everyone will see the Son of Man arriving in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send angels, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. So the first time I read through it, the first couple times, I'm like, clearly this is future. And after 2 weeks of study, my paradigm completely shifted, just about a month ago. But I'm studying this, And I'm like, I try to take the Bible literally. I try to take it literally, right? And what I don't know is the more faithful reading isn't always literal. It's in its literary sense. And so when I'm studying, I'm reading, and I find that this exact phrase has been used multiple times in the Old Testament, not only as a prophecy, but as a prophecy that's also had fulfillments.
And which phrase is that again?
Yeah, the sun being darkened and the moon not shedding its light, the stars falling from heaven. And then I got to thinking, I'm like, okay, this has been used in the Old Testament before and fulfilled as a prophecy, so we need to check those instances out and see what those mean. The other thing that got me is like, well, if this is used in the Old Testament and stars have fallen from heaven, well, that didn't happen literally in the Old Testament, or the earth would have been destroyed, right? If all these stars, like literally, like, for the stars come from heaven, it would obliterate the earth, right? They would have been really tiny stars, so when we're thinking stars. Astrology, right? Exactly. So, yeah. So, anyways, that got me thinking, but I'd love to talk to you. I've got Isaiah 13 marked here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular issue, how David, taking the Bible literally, is in general a good way to go, but maybe talk a little bit about literal sense, and then maybe the specific of this phrasing of the sun being darkened, the moon being darkened, and the stars falling from heaven. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, a lot of preterists will talk about this and they'll say, well, this is apocalyptic talk by Christ. And God did do that in the Old Testament, the prophets, as you pointed out. Isaiah does some of it. Now, I think that it's possible you and I could diverge on ideas here.
Sure.
And I do diverge with a lot of preterists on this. And that is that I don't see this as apocalyptic hyperbole. I don't see it as that. But what I do see here is very spiritual things being talked about. That if the powers of heaven are shaken, and this is a very specific phrase that means something. It doesn't, we see the word powers, and we in English, we never use that word. We never say that. But that phrase to them meant the angel powers, the types of dominions and principalities that lived in heaven.
Yeah.
And so if those are shaken, that means something's going on spiritually that we're not going to see.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, the stars of heaven. Now, if you've read the book of Enoch or some of the other pseudepigrapha surrounding the Old Testament, that in most prophetic literature, when stars are in heaven and they're falling or doing, even in the book of Enoch, the stars are angels.
Yeah.
They're called luminaries.
Yeah.
And so my perspective on this, being slightly different than I think a lot of preterists, is that I see these as spiritual, not allegorical.
Yeah.
And so now the thing here that's not either one is that the sun was darkened and the moon wouldn't give light, because that stuff happened in the first century. We have that recorded in the historians of the first century. And for those listening, if you're making mental notes, note Josephus, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius. There's 4 right there that give evidence of the events of the first century in regards to the temple in 70 AD. But let me just tell you, I've done other videos on this. There was multiple times when the day was dark. It went dark.
Yeah.
They had 2 eclipses in the sky at the same time on one day during this time period. They had one eclipse where the moon turned to blood and then started cycling colors. This is recorded in Cassius Dio.
Wow.
I mean, things that I can't even believe, but they're recorded. So let me just put it this way. If half of them are true, it was crazy. It was crazy town.
Yeah.
And so, some of these things, I think, yes, this is apocalyptic talk, but if God is doing some kind of judgment, and that's coming from heaven because God's in heaven, then some of these things might actually be happening literally in the spiritual realm, but we can't see it. That's where I diverge a little bit. I don't take an allegorical or metaphorical tack with these types of things, but I do take a spiritual tack. and that's just kind of how I go at this.
Yeah.
That's how I see most of that stuff. But either way, I would say you have to admit that this is valid in the first century.
Yeah, and I actually wholeheartedly agree with you on that.
Yeah.
I think we see that the same way.
Okay.
For me, yeah, we completely agree on this. So the way I see it is that it's, I guess you could call it symbolic or allegorical, or I wouldn't call it allegorical. I'd probably call it symbolic in the sense that I think it is speaking of an overthrow of a political entity, because I think that's how it's used in Isaiah 13, which I'll pull up and show.
Yeah.
But what you said is so key because, you know, in an Old Testament Israelite worldview, as you mentioned, stars are angels. You know, I always think of that Lion King scene with Pumbaa and Simba and Timon. They're looking up, you know, he's like, I think they're great balls of gas. And they all laugh at him, you know, and they're like, well, I've been told it's a king. So for the Israelites, if you're listening, they saw these, whether literally or symbolically, I'm not sure, but when they spoke of stars, when they speak of anything like that, they're speaking, like you say, David, of angelic powers, rulers.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to that Psalm 82, goes back to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, this idea that after the Tower of Babel, Yahweh distributes the peoples of the earth to various lesser G gods, is what I would call them, or high powerful angels, is how maybe everyone would understand it. But in the Bible, it actually calls them little G gods, is how the scriptures determine them. But we get
let's
freaked out
be
with that language.
crisp on that. Let's
but
be crisp
high
on
powerful
that because,
angels. Yeah.
Because when we say the word gods, I just want for the listeners, because our word God, whether you use a little or a big G, is a lot different than their word Elohim in the Hebrew.
Yeah, that's good.
Their word Elohim in the Hebrew was a very ambiguous word. We don't have as many, I don't think, in our language, ambiguity as they did in their language in Hebrew. But that word means a lot of different things.
Like
it can be used for
being,
angels and gods and all sorts of stuff. Spiritual beings is really, I think, the best way to translate that term.
Yeah.
So yes, I agree with you. These beings, these principalities, is the word I usually use for them. They're high order angel type beings.
Yeah.
I mean, they're Elohim.
Yeah. That's good. No, thanks for stepping in, because I think, like, I always use that word little G God and it throws people off. The reason I do it is, I know it causes a little bit of confusion, but the reason I do it is because like, in the sense that we believe there are false gods in the world, like Baal, right? In the Old Testament, to some people, they are literally their gods, but it's a false god. True. It's not Yahweh. And so I almost try to confuse people. No, I don't try to confuse people, but I try to, like, get them to wrestle with, like, no, like, in some sense, to some people, although we know this is false, it was a type of a god, but it's a created being, not in the same as Yahweh.
Absolutely.
So, no, thanks for clarifying. My wife gets on me because I confuse people about that. But so I just wanted to read Isaiah 13, verse 9. And this is concerning the judgment of Babylon, which was the first world empire, the lion with wings that we talked about earlier. Look, the Lord's day of judgment is coming. It is a day of cruelty and savage, raging anger, destroying the earth and annihilating its sinners. Boy, if we take that literally, the earth should have already been destroyed, you know. Indeed, and this is where we just talked about in the Olivet Discourse. Indeed, verse 10, the stars in the sky and their constellations no longer give out their light. The sun is darkened as soon as it rises, and the moon does not shine. I mean, it's phrase for phrase the exact same thing we're talking about. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked people for their sin. I will put an end to it. So this was an Old Testament prophecy, and there's multiple ones we could look at. I won't get into all of them. I did, I think, in other videos in the Olivet Discourse. But the point here is that this isn't the first time this phrase has ever been used, the sun darkening, the moon darkening, the stars falling from the sky. This is something that is rooted in Old Testament theology. And it was used there by God in through the prophet Isaiah. It was to speak of the total destruction of that first world empire. And God was going to judge them. And I do think, as we've mentioned, it's also referencing these false powers at work. I mean, when we look at Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, and then we look at Psalm 81, 82, what we see is that God entrusted certain angelic beings, spirit beings, high powerful beings to help run the world. And what we see in Psalm 82 is that he judges them because they're doing all kinds of terrible things. They're leading people astray and drawing people into false worship. And so that's what we see in the Psalms. And when the Bible's speaking of these things, like you mentioned, David, it's speaking of a destruction of a political upheaval, but tied to that political system is a false deity. And so I think, of course, here Jesus in the Olivet Discourse is speaking of Jerusalem, but what he's speaking of is the overthrow of the system, the overthrow of this great city. And I think you have to really cut out all these prophecies in the Old Testament that mention the same wording to make this mean something other than what it's always meant in the Old Testament. I think for me, that was the real linchpin where I'm like, okay, I think he was talking about something in his generation, because if this was the only time that this phrasing has ever been used in the Bible, maybe we can run with it, right? Wherever we want to go. But this has been used multiple times, and every time it's ever been used, it's speaking of this twofold thing of a political upheaval of God using a nation or something to destroy the guilty party. But likewise, it's also speaking that truth that through these false empires, there's false deities that in the heavenlies are being thrown down, maybe with literal spiritual battle going on, It's really interesting.
And that to me, along with, understanding that, along with the context of the history of the first century. And again, I go back to a lot of the miraculous events that the Romans reported happened. I even found one where they said in one of the temples, one of the pagan temples, the Roman soldiers saw footsteps in the dirt of someone they couldn't see. I mean, so many things like that. And it's like the power of it to me was overwhelming when I started to realize this. And I was like, I started to praise God, and I almost started to weep at some points, because I was like, God, this was your outstretched arm, the same one that rescued the Israelites out of Egypt. And I just was like praising him, crying, and, it was probably pitiful, but it just was like, it was overwhelming that, for such a long time in my life, I didn't see these things and give God the due credit, right?
Yeah, right.
That's what I want. More than anything, I want to give God credit for things he's done, right? And it's like, I thought before I knew, but there was this huge pivotal moment in history that I had totally been unaware of. I think that's profound. And I think that's the power of understanding these passages. You start to realize that it gets in you, and then you're so, I don't know, there's a lot of joy there for me and excitement. And so,
it's cool. I mean, God came through on his promise. I think when I taught through the Olivet Discourse, that crazy 2-hour video, I think I recorded 8 or 9 just reading through Josephus, miraculous events that pertain right to the destruction of the temple. And I'm just like you said earlier on another topic, if even half of these things are true, this is significant. But so many of the recordings were straight out of the Old Testament, things God has done before when he judges a nation, or and I was just like, man, this is so crazy. And I'm with you. I mean, if God has prophesied something and then he acted on that promise and fulfilled that in a supernatural, miraculous way, I want to know about it. I don't want to turn a blind eye to it and be looking for something he already did, So, no, that's really good. That's really good. Cool. Well, I'd love to jump from here to the next chapter in Mark, which is where we get this phrasing. It's Mark chapter 14, verse 62, where Jesus tells him that you'll see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And just for our listeners, I'm showing my screen here on Mark 13 as well. He says, so the Olivet Discourse, he's with the inner circle plus Andrew, so those 4 brothers, and he's predicting the destruction of the physical temple. And when he's doing that, as we just read, he says the stars will be falling from heaven, the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then verse 26 of 13, he says, then everyone will see the Son of Man arriving in the clouds with a great power and glory. and then he'll send his angels to gather his elect. So in Mark 13, he's telling the inner circle with clarity. He's saying, look, everyone, right, in this generation, they're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And then when he's being interviewed, which what I'd like to pick your brain about, David, in chapter 14, verse 62, he's standing before the high priest, and he gives him that same phrase. He says, he asks him in 60, then the high priest stood up before them, asked Jesus, have you no answer? What is this they are testifying against you? But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest questioned him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And he says in 62, I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power, the power being another name for the Almighty or of God, and coming with the clouds of heaven. So what does this mean? David, enlighten us. What this phrase, right? I know it's from Daniel, right? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what he's meaning by this.
Well, to me, again, this is one of those where he says you're going to see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power. And that to me harkens right back to Psalm, where David is saying,
Psalm 110.
Yes, yeah. 110.
Yeah.
He says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand.
Yeah.
So David,
make your enemies my footstool, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
David talking about his throne, Jesus' throne was right beside God's in heaven. So when I hear that, I'm thinking of the throne of God, right? And I'm thinking, well, man, is Caiaphas going to be able to see the throne of God? Because that's in the highest heaven, apparently, from what I've read. And then coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, whatever form that took in the first century, and I truly believe that if we'd been there and seen it and I think I would have been blown away.
Yeah.
Whatever it was, I know that reading Josephus, at the time of the temple destruction, there was this huge storm, and all the people that saw this storm, it was so violent, they said, this has to be a sign for something bad.
Yeah, right.
All the soldiers were sitting there watching it going, this is terrible. Yeah. Something's happening. What's happening? Is that what they're talking about? I don't know. I don't know that for sure, Grant. Yeah. And it's like one of those things where, I can't for specific say if there was a visible thing that was seen. There were visible things, obviously,
sure.
But
which one was
what does it mean specifically? Does it mean that, or does it mean something?
Yeah,
it's hard for me to say, but all I do know is that these things seem to point, like we said about the previous passage, seems to point to exactly what Christ was telling them was going to happen in their lifetimes. And he not only said that, by the way, in the Olivet Discourse, he also said it, I pulled it up here in Matthew 16. He said it in a totally different context. He said, there will be some standing here that will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right.
So either he lied or this was what he was talking about.
Yep, that's right before he climbs up on the Mount of Transfiguration, right?
Yeah. And
it's recorded in that same order in every one of the Gospels. I think I probably marred it in my first teaching.
You can't ignore that, right? And so it's like, man, this is definitely what he's talking about. Now, again, I can't tell you what that looked like, but I know that everybody who experienced it was scared to death because that's what's in the history books, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that's an honest answer. I appreciate that. And like I said, when I taught through the Olivet Discourse in that really long video, I counted somewhere around 8 supernatural, miraculous, freaky, clear signs from God, right? In Josephus. And he even says himself, he's like, I wouldn't record this if there wasn't so many witnesses because it's so bizarre. And I'm like, man, like he is so weirded out by the events that as a historian and with his high reputation, he wouldn't have written it down if there wasn't, but he's like, everyone saw this, so I'm going to write it down. And one of the things is in the heavens, they saw themselves surrounded by armies. And so I don't know if that's the, specific fulfillment. I think it could have been any of them, could have been all of them. But for me, it's like what it means that you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power. What he means is that you will see high priest, you will see Peter, James, John, and Andrew. you'll see that I have taken up authority, and it will be proven here on the earth. And I think the destruction, the judgment of his own temple, the closing out of the old covenant by the breaking of the covenant of his Old Testament people, I think the Lord in many ways, with many signs that I've spoken about before and Josephus records, he was showing that, look, I am in authority now. I'm in power now. And you're going to see that, I think sometimes we're running to a wooden literal translation, like he's going to look up and there he is. But
Right.
maybe he meant something else, right? Maybe he meant like, no, you're going to recognize that I'm in authority. You're going to recognize that I am at the right hand of the Father, not by seeing like a physical God whose spirit, and Jesus in the heavens, right? Not by like, gaping into the heavenlies, but by literally seeing like what is to take place in his lifetime.
Well, if we try to be 100% literal with that, in my view, it's like, well, what did Christ look like? Like he looked like a human. His resurrected body was very human-like, right? Just spiritual in a way, right?
Sure.
And so let's say that he actually floated down and was up there in the cloud. He would look like a little. He would look like a little dot of light, right?
Yeah.
So who am I to say that did or didn't happen? We have no way to know, really, right? So it's like, I don't even try. I'm just like, this is obviously talking about what happened then. So.
I think as Westerners, we, to a fault, take everything as most literally as we possibly can, even if it makes no sense, I think, like, that's my bias. Like, when I come to a text, like, that's how I read it. Like, without extra study or something, I'll read a text. I'm like, okay, stars are going to fall from heaven, but...
Yeah. And I want to add to that, too. I want to say, I may be literal, but also very materialistic.
Yeah.
Materialistic. Because what we always do is we think the mark of the beast, well, when is the barcode going to be imprinted on my hand? Or when is the microchip going to be stuck into my flesh?
Yeah. Where do we find that in Revelation, right? A barcode, a microchip.
And so now we're looking for something very, very physical. And I have a whole video on actually other biblical references that show marks, and they're always spiritual. They're never visible.
No, that's right.
And
it's
so
symbolism.
I'm just saying that, like you're saying, we tend to come with a very Western, materialistic, scientific kind of mind. And so we always look for the materialistic view first. And if we don't see it, then sometimes we go, well, that must be an allegory, or it must be a symbol or something else, So
that's a good point. Yeah. We are people of our time.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. So, no, that's really helpful. I just wanted to show people that Old Testament passage because I think it's so often used. And then Mark 14:62, the Son of Man sitting, he tells the high priest, like we've just said, that he will see that take place. And he just told him in the previous chapter, the disciples, you guys will see this take place. And then, if we come on and bring a heavy systematic theology view, we say, well, I know he told this group and that group and this group over here that it would be, for them to witness, but actually none of them saw any of this, I think it's a stretch, and not only is it a stretch, but to me, part of Jesus being the true Son of God, part of him being deity, involves him being a true prophet. And so whenever he prophesies, we hold him to the test of a prophet of the Old Testament, that what he prophesies must come to pass for him to be a true prophet, for him to be a son of God. So I think we don't realize it, and we unintentionally discredit our own Savior with the twisting of some of these prophecies.
I would just agree with you on that.
And I know like it's hard to put it that strongly, and I'm not trying to offend people, but again, I think it's unintentional, right? And well-meaning, but nevertheless, the end result is we end up making Jesus not to be a true prophet, I think. Again, unintentionally, not with evil, anything like that, but it's just, that's where it ultimately leads. That's what I want to warn people of, And I know you do as well, and that's what you've talked about a lot. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the second coming of Christ, and maybe comparing, maybe this is 10,000 questions, I don't know, but the second coming of Christ or maybe the culmination of Christ in history. And, when Jesus said here in these passages we've looked at, Mark 13, Mark 14, that he was going to come on the clouds, I think it's clear biblically in our Old Testament what he meant by that. But David, is this to be confused with other things said in the New Testament of the world coming to an end, or of Christ, closing out history, right? Maybe the full preterist view, right? If that's even what that is, I don't know. So could you help us maybe tease out like what this is that happened in 70 AD, and then the first resurrection, second resurrection? I don't know if that's a good question or if that even makes any sense, but.
No, I think so. So, I took most of my notes here on the first and second resurrections to talk about that. I think as far as Christ's coming in 70 AD, this was definitely a pivotal moment. The reason I think it's pivotal is now I think I understand it to be a little different than I did before. But I think the reason it's pivotal is because of the kingdom, right? The kingdom was established.
Yeah.
And of all the other things that Christ did, yes, he atoned for our sin. Yes, he rescued the righteous out of Hades. Yes, he did all these different things. He put down the nations.
Yeah.
He gained all authority. And that was all about the kingdom. And we are part of that. And so to me, that is the thing that happened and that we need to be so aware of. And in regards to these resurrections, Revelation 20 is where it talks about this first resurrection.
Mm.
And so again, to me, this is what the Jews had been talking about and batting around in their rabbinical texts for centuries. And so they expected the righteous from Adam forward who had died and were essentially resting in Hades, waiting for this Redeemer that actually in a lot of ancient texts, God gives the prophecy that this Redeemer was going to come rescue them out of Hades. So this is what the Jews had been talking about for a very long time, the resurrection.
And could I insert something?
Yeah.
Hades, for our listeners, is Hades, we might hear that and think eternal hell, damnation, but Hades in the Old Testament would have been more like Sheol, like a holding place for dead people, not necessarily a place of torment and punishment. Is that right? Is that how you'd understand it?
I believe that's true. And I see Sheol and Hades as just Hebrew and Greek equivalents of the exact same thing.
Me too. Yeah. Okay, cool.
And so, I call it the underworld.
Yeah.
And
the holding
for
place
lack of a better term,
dead people.
Well, and there's a lot of places there. There's if you've read the book of Enoch, there's lots of divisions and different parts for different things, and angel prisons and Tartarus and all sorts of stuff. Okay. But there is a landscape, like a spiritual landscape like that. And it's, so it's very prolific. But in Revelation 20, we see this mentioned, and this is this is a hard passage. I'm just going to leave that on the table too. This passage is not easy. Revelation 20 is not easy.
Yeah.
But there is something that as I really studied through this thing, and I've read the book of Revelation, I don't know how many, probably 24 times at least straight through.
Sure.
And then of course on studies like this, you deep dive into little parts here and again, there and again. But in verse 5, it says, but the rest of the dead, and this is after the 1,000 years, it says the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Now, the problem is we need to remember that in Greek, because I have gone to the earliest manuscripts we have of this, the codices and different. In the Greek, it's all lowercase. There's no word divisions. There's no verse divisions. There's no chapter divisions. It's one long text, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what is, I think, our problem here that trips us up every time is that this verse 5 in chapter 20 of Revelation, the sentence, this is the first resurrection, was meant as a kind of encapsulation of everything it had just talked about. Everything it had just talked about was that the saints were raised.
Yeah, verse 1 through 4, right?
Yep, they were raised. and put on thrones. And it talks about all the other stuff that happens during that time, the 1,000 years and Satan bound and everything. And then it says this was the first resurrection, essentially.
Yeah.
Everything I just described to you, that's the first resurrection. And that's about the saints who had been waiting in Hades and were resurrected before the millennium started. And so with that understanding, it makes a lot more sense. Okay. Because when I first read this, I thought, well, there already was a resurrection in verse 1 or whatever, but what it's talking about is kind of an encapsulation, an outline saying that thing I just told you all about, even though it spanned 1,000, I was talking about that first resurrection.
Yeah.
And so then it says, blessed and holy is he that has part in that first resurrection, because on such the second death, meaning the lake of fire, has no power. Those people that were resurrected to start the kingdom, they will never see the lake of fire, obviously, right? And so that makes 100% sense. So now we've identified that first resurrection. And then when we talk about a second resurrection, to be honest, like I've searched a lot of text and never do I see a second resurrection mentioned that way in that phrasing. Cool. So I do believe that quote, first resurrection was the resurrection, like I said, that the Jews had been looking for, that it had been prophesied. But if there is a second resurrection, it could possibly be how in Revelation 25, it says, but the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were finished. Perhaps that was a second-ish resurrection. But I honestly, on that verse, I'm just a little foggy, so I'm not going to say I know. But to be honest, that's all I know of a possible second resurrection, other than the fact that a Christian at his death will be taken up to be with those who are in heaven. Yeah. And if you want to call that a resurrection, but that would be a personal one, not a corporate. So gotcha. That's where I go on that. I don't know how you see it, but
I don't know how I see it, man.
It's a hard one. It's a hard passage. It really is.
Yeah. So let's think about this in timetables. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I'm really, like I said, I have no idea. I can tell you what the Olivet Discourse means, but this is something else. But so with Jesus's resurrection, we have 3 days later, he's physically, bodily, and in a new type of body, but still physical, resurrected. After 3 days, there's a weird ending in Matthew that records other saints being resurrected from the dead. And then there's this other passage in 2 Peter that records Jesus descending into, is it Hades? To the underworld to preach to the ones that were condemned, the dead ones, to preach. And then he is raised back up. It says the ones that he went to go preach to were from the days of Noah. We could go 1,000 ways, but help me and help our listeners understand your view on understanding these in regards to the resurrection, and then what you just went over in Revelation 20 verse 1 through 5. Like, give us a timetable and some labels does that make sense, to properly understand these things that happen, and I, whether you to the best of your ability, because this is sticky.
Thinking now, and this just goes to show that this is all complicated and that I think I just got something wrong. But so I believe that when Jesus did die on the cross, and most people, I would say the majority of Christians don't understand this. It's mentioned in the Bible, but it's mentioned very briefly, and that is that he did go to Hades. Yeah. And that he did something there. That's about all the Bible really talks about. Right. It just doesn't go into detail. Yeah. And so, but Jesus did, and there's a lot of writings that attest to this, including the early Christians who were right after this time period. They wrote about it. So we know that that's what they thought happened, right? Yeah. So he went there, and the way I understand it is that at the time he died and went down to Hades in those 3 days, he did come out with the righteous that were there, from Adam to Abraham to everyone that had died that was righteous before he came. Yeah. And they were taken to paradise, which is the Garden of Eden, by the way, as far as the texts speak. Now, then what we just talked about in Revelation 20 was actually at the time of his coming in 70 AD. And why was it? Because who is it in chapter 20 that is resurrected? It's the saints, it's the martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ones who get the white robes for being martyred for the blood, for their testimony of Christ during the tribulation period, the 40 years essentially, and then that last 3.5 that was Crazy Town. They were martyred for it. So this is I think I'm going to say it right in saying this is the first fruits of the kingdom, but they are the first ones to be resurrected and made on kings on thrones, essentially, to rule in the kingdom for 1,000 years during the millennium. And there's a lot of texts in Revelation that speak about this and these people, but these martyrs were special. They were special because they had to go through this time period.
Right.
And so there was the resurrection of the righteous dead out of Hades when Christ went down there, and he went to heaven for the 40 years. There were a lot of martyrs martyred. A lot of Christians died for their beliefs, a lot of Jewish Christians and Gentiles. And then at the end of that, that's the start of the kingdom for realsies. And he takes them who had been martyred because of their sacrifice, and they were purified by that, is I think how it talks about it in Revelation. They were taken to be the first part of that kingdom, set on thrones, given white robes, and they stood in judgment over wicked Israel and the others that it talks about multiple times in the Gospels. Jesus says they will rise up and judge you, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's what it's talking about.
Yeah.
So that's my view on that, really.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can't say whether, I agree or disagree. I have no idea, but no, that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
It would take a long time to exegete that.
Yeah.
So
no. I completely agree. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts, and no, that's super helpful. I think sometimes if we project too much into the future or we misalign things, we end up having to create additional beliefs to reconcile with what the text is actually saying, or we try to create dual fulfillments where there isn't, or we try to make up fulfillment. I don't know. It goes all over the place. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that passage. No, it's really helpful.
Good.
Yeah. Thanks, David. So the last question I wanted us to talk about, and if there's anything else, I'd love to hear if you've got some other things that would be worth talking through, but whether you would consider Revelation apocalyptic literature or not, how you would see it, or at least I'm sure you'd probably see at least chapters 4 through 20 as a vision, and help us as Westerners understand Scripture in context. For example, with my Daniel videos that I did, chapter 7 through 12, a lot of people were really confused because I wasn't diving into allegory or symbolism. All I'm doing is saying, here's this crazy kooky vision, but hey, pay attention, because Gabriel shows up in just the next section of the chapter, and he explains all this stuff in very literal message and meaning. So people get fixated on the visions, and they're like running all over to, a different universe with these interpretations. Yeah. And then they disregard the angel Gabriel's literal interpretation of the crazy vision. And they're like, how did you land there? Like, you're a heretic. And I'm like, no, just pay attention to the angel. He interprets this for you.
Passage.
Yeah. Just keep reading. Yeah. So
That's
help
right.
us with Revelation. Do you think people should see this as a certain type of genre that maybe overlaps with the visions of Daniel, or should we take all this wooden and literal? Should we look for a red horse galloping on the street in 21st century America? What should we do with these sections? And then I'd also, along with the type of literature that Revelation is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the context. All right, I said a joke earlier that many people read Revelation like it was written to the churches in North America of the 21st century, but that's not how it reads. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on context, right? Audience and type of literature.
Well, let's talk about that first. I think the context of Revelation, to me, is so well set up for us, really, in the beginning
4
of
chapters of
the
context.
book. Man, yeah, it's like if you didn't know this was written to you, this was given to you, John, so you could take it to the churches because they
Yeah.
need it. But in the futurist eschatology, and I'm guilty of believing this at one time too, but
Yeah.
there's the whole idea, there's many ideas, but one of them is that the churches are allegorical representations of the chapters of the history of the Christian church to our modern age, and it's like, so I don't know which church we are. We're one of them, maybe the last one. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that, to me, I mean, I've heard that teaching, and even when I heard it, I was like, are you sure that's what this is about? But yeah, the context is truly, and okay, so here's one thing that must be understood or at least discussed, and that is the dating of the book.
That's important.
Because the traditional dating of the book is around 92 AD in the reign of Domitian.
Yeah.
Caesar Domitian.
Yeah,
And
let's park the car here for a second, because I've actually been rigorously studying that. I'd love to hear your
Okay.
thoughts on that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I was going to
Whether the listeners care or not, I'd like to hear.
Well, it's important because at
Yeah.
90, in the year 90 or 92, if the vision was given around that time frame, then we have to ask ourselves, how does that help the churches? What was going on in 90 or
Yeah.
92 or in that time frame that was affecting the churches in Asia?
Yeah.
And it really wasn't much,
Yeah.
because the Romans had defeated the Jews, put down all the zealots. The Neronic persecution had ended. From the history books, we don't get much in the way of persecution during that time period. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what was the book given to them for if it was given in that time period? And so when you study into the why it's dated in 90 or 92, it's because of one singular thing, and that is a quote in Tertullian's writings, right? That says,
or Irenaeus.
Is it Irenaeus? I may have it
is.
wrong.
That's okay.
It
No,
could-
I think
it could
it's
be.
Irenaeus. Yeah. But yeah.
But that quote says that, and it's very general in the Greek. It's not even very specific. It says
Yeah.
something about the vision of John in one sentence.
Yeah.
And then it uses a very indiscriminate pronoun to say either it or him or something
Or
was
that,
then
yeah.
seen
Yeah.
was then seen in during the reign of Domitian,
Yeah.
about 92 AD.
That's right.
Well, is it talking about that John saw the vision, or did they see John, or did they see the writing? Did they see the book or
Yeah.
his letter? Nobody knows, but they use that as the proof for why they date the book to 92 AD.
I think thousands of people, when we get to heaven, will surround Irenaeus, whoever it was. I think it was Irenaeus, and grill him for confusing the whole church for 2,000 years, because no one understood what he meant in that sentence for us to date and interpret the book of Revelation. But that's where everyone runs. And sadly, all the fathers following that quote just quote it verbatim. They don't change it. They don't speak into it. They just quote it verbatim. And so all we have is that misconstrued, confusing phrase repeated throughout church history. And so I watched a debate, 3-part. It was like a 3-hour debate with Hank Hanegraaff and somebody from a dispensational group, I think at Dallas Theological Seminary. And the guy listed like 10 early church fathers as all supporting this view. And I'm like, that's kind of a stretch, because they all just quote exactly what he said, and they don't engage with his view at all. They just write it down and repeat it,
Yeah.
So anyways, but
Well, then when you really examine this thing and you get into it, you find a few things that give you pause, right? And one is the tone and exactly what we already talked about, the churches. Like, when would they have needed this? When were they under persecution? Well, it was before the temple was destroyed. It was in around 65 AD, 60 to 65. And people also say, because that quote includes something about the Isle of Patmos, I think it says well, I'm not going to quote it. I don't have it in front of me.
In the beginning, John speaks of being exiled to Patmos, and then,
Right.
I think you're going like most people speak of Domitian
Well,
exiling somebody. Yeah.
that's right. But the thing is, he doesn't say he was exiled there. And I found other
Hmm.
writings that say that he went there to preach to those at the Isle.
Hmm.
So there's a high possibility there were other times he was on that island
Yeah, sure.
doing a circuit, just like Paul did on his missionary journeys. He went around all the different places teaching, and I think that John literally was doing the same types of things, and that one of those times he saw this vision. It
Yeah.
doesn't say that in Revelation. It doesn't say he was exiled. It just says he was on the island. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then the other thing is the internal evidence of the book. There's no mention of the destruction of the temple, the most significant event in the history of the Jewish nation. In fact, there's a passage in Revelation that talks about the angel talking to him saying, go measure the temple and see what the measurements are thereof. Well,
right.
If there was no temple on earth at that time, what was he talking about?
And
right?
why measure the temple that God has destroyed to speak judgment over
Exactly.
the temple, right?
So there's a lot of that. There's a
Yeah.
lot of, it seems like a lot of evidence that there's a likelihood of a date, and I think it's around 60 to 65 AD that it was written, because that was probably when the churches would have needed it the most, right before the worst persecution started.
Yeah.
So to me, that is the context truly of the book. And so the Christians, again, like in the other passage, they were worried, they were scared. There was a lot going on, a lot of wars being fought, soldiers everywhere. And so if you are in the middle of the most significant spiritual eschatological event in history, but you're physical, you're human, you're not seeing all the spiritual things going on, what might you need to hear to know that it's going to be okay, that God has it all under control? Well, he goes into heaven and he sees a huge vision of what's going to be happening from a spiritual perspective. And it's very spiritual. There's a lot of spiritual things that happen, but it gives them the context for understanding that what they are part of is a bigger picture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot going on they can't see, and it just hold on tight because he will resolve it. And this is how, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that is truly the context of the book that is given to these churches and why it helps them, because they're like, why there's earthquakes. I mean, there was like, I counted in reading the historians, there were like 12 different times where there were earthquakes that were some big enough to destroy cities.
And what does Jesus say in the Olivet Discourse? When you see those, the end is not yet.
That's right.
And there were famines. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It was a scary time. And so to me, that's how I see it. As if I had received this in the first century, it would have given me some hope. It'd have been like, there's things going on we don't see, so we've got to hang on tight. We've got to hold the line. We've got to stay strong in our beliefs and our boldness for Christ, because in the end, there will be a reward for us for that, as he said, right? Yeah. And so to me, that would have given me all the context I needed. And so that truly is what makes sense for me when I come to the book of Revelation.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. The other two things that stand out to me, I'd love to share my thoughts and maybe hear if you have any things. Yeah. The long list of timestamps we find in Revelation, very soon, very soon, very soon. It is at hand. It is about to happen. Yeah. Almost need to be cut out of the scriptures. If this is 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, how far removed is this,
Yeah.
And people always run to the passage in Peter that one day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years are like one day. And that's true in its context. But what God is seemingly trying to do here is to give people an idea that something's around the corner. And again, I think if we look at all this together in context, we have the prophecies of Daniel. So if they know Daniel, they know all that's supposed to take place somewhere around their generation. Then you take everything Jesus taught them at the Olivet Discourse for the final things. The Olivet Discourse is significantly important because he reveals when you see earthquakes, when you see famines, that is not the end. Don't be alarmed. People are going to show up saying they're the Messiah. It's not me. When I show up, you're going to know, right? And then he tells them the sign that Luke, I think, records very well. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's when you leave. That's when you get out.
Yeah.
And he gives them all this clear prophecy to guide them in their lifetime. And then again, we have this recording in the historians of the early church in which all the Christians left the city right before this happened. And that wasn't customary. Usually you go inside the walls, you get in the city when you get attacked, but rather the Christians, they left all their stuff and got out of town, went to the mountains. And I think whether you believe it or not, to wholly discount it and not engage it, right, or consider the possibility that it's true, it's crazy. It's just not wise. That was the timestamps, and then the church history of the Christians of their day getting out, come out of her, just like it's recorded in Revelation, right? But the other thing that I wanted to hear your thoughts on is the writer of Revelation, John, he says, and I believe it's in Revelation 17, but he says there are five. There were five kings. There is one, and there are some to come after that, I believe. Maybe I marred that text. I'll pull it up. Are you familiar with that passage, and has that played any part in your understanding of dating the book of Revelation? Because I think another thing I wanted to mention, like you said, the dating is so important because, one, the time stamps where it says, hey, whatever this is talking about, it's right here in the near future. The other thing where I think it's really important is because, again, if this did take place in 95 AD, we need to, old Bible Scribe and Grant Mooney to get off their YouTube channel talking about some crazy mess about, some of this being fulfilled, right? But if it was written before that, then it lines up with so many things, right? And if it's written after that, I don't know what we do with it, honestly.
We're in worse shape than we were as futurists. I mean, really.
Yeah, no doubt. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the king's statement, because I think a lot of people try to just start the emperors with whatever one they want to start with that lines up with their dating of the book. And
well, and I wish I had it in front of me. I don't. Well, I might be able to get it here, but I think we'll be fine without it, because what happens when you look at the Caesars of the first century, and know that in the previous verse it says, and it's talking about the beast, and he says the seven heads are seven mountains. Well, Rome is the city on seven hills. Right? Yeah,
and it's 17 verse 9, I think. If you had it.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Sorry, man.
And then it says, then there are seven kings. So the seven mountains were the seven hills of Rome. It's identified where they're coming from, and then the seven kings. So now we're talking about the Caesars.
Yeah.
And when you count from, I think it was Augustus, the first Caesar proper. I mean, he really started the whole thing. And then you count to Nero. You get the five are fallen, one is. So five had come before Nero. Nero was the one in power at the time of this writing.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is not yet come. And when he comes, it will be a short time.
Yeah. Galba.
And Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, the next three, they were all only emperor or Caesar for like months, a period of months. They were all like ousted, killed, whatever. And so this was a very short time. I think looking back at Galba specifically, it was like 4 months.
Yes, 4 to 7, which is extremely short, right? We're not talking decades. It's just, this guy didn't make it to a full year.
Nero's reign was years. So, in contrast, but definitely matches this perfectly.
Yeah.
And so you have to say to yourself, wow, it really does match. So then, like you said, you've got to grapple with that somehow. Either you're just going to dismiss it, or you're going to realize that it truly does match those Caesars and makes sense. It would have made so much sense to him, right?
Yeah.
So, that's how I see that. And to me, that passage, that verse is just really key in dating the book, right?
Yeah.
Once you see how that fits, it's amazing. But
yeah, and for our listeners, when scholars come to do certain things like interpreting books, dating books, looking at the author of books, looking at the time period in which the book was written, they look at two categories. One thing they call is internal evidence. The other is external evidence. And when it comes to dating of books, that's what they look at. So sometimes internal evidence means the counting of words and things like that. I'm not talking about that. Internal evidence here, as we're just talking about, this is internal evidence. This is chapter 17, verse 9 through 11. This gives us an idea, although because it's an apocalyptic type work, it's kind of shrouded in mystery. And this may have been for the safety of the writer John, so that, the Roman soldiers wouldn't round him up and kill him. But when they read him say bluntly, hey, Nero is of the devil, and, he couldn't just walk around. So some have said that. But anyways, this is what they call internal evidence. And what David is saying is that what's usually cited to date the book is not from Scripture, but rather it's Irenaeus, who's important, who we need to wrestle with, who we need to listen to, but he's not, the Holy Spirit writing the Bible. Instead, he's a man that comes in close to 100 to 100 AD, somewhere around there. I don't know the time of his writing of that phrase, but it's much later, and that's called external evidence, pointing to a dating of the book. And so I think external evidence is extremely important, but I do think personally, and I'm sure David will probably agree, that God's word, the internal evidence, should trump the external evidence. So
I think it does definitely, in general speaking, and in this case, because of that quote from Irenaeus, it's just not specific enough for us to take as even a direct statement about the book.
Yeah,
I think we have to go with the internal evidence way over the external evidence, which we just don't have much of.
Yeah, and the quote from Irenaeus, it's really ambiguous, like you mentioned, and also it could very easily mean that people saw John still alive in the reign of Domitian. Not that he wrote the book of Revelation. He's speaking of Revelation and he's speaking of John, and he has this, like you said, this ambiguous noun or pronoun to say it or that or him was seen in the reign of Domitian. So he could have very easily, this one little section of Irenaeus that we get so hung up on, he could have easily said that John was still alive, because again, John was the only apostle who lived to a ripe old age, because church tradition tells us they tried to kill him and they were unable for whatever reason. Every other apostle was put to death pretty early, say 60s or so.
And Grant, I wanted to mention this because you're bringing it up. I also found in my study, and I'm not going to remember where this was, I think it was another church father, that I found talking about John at this time frame. And it said that at this time frame in the 90s, of course, he was old.
Yeah.
It said that he was at the point where he needed help walking in through the church.
Clement of Alexandria. Yeah, he says
is
this.
It? Yes.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, is that the age at which a man would be able to handily record this type of vision? And again, it's just one of those things that's like, that doesn't really fit.
Yeah.
It doesn't really fit.
It was already shaky evidence on the first thing, but to add this in there, it further muddies this view, right? It's possible, right? But
why would the emperor banish him to an island when he was so frail he couldn't walk?
Yeah.
Just none of that fits very well. So
like I said, especially when we stack it on the rest of,
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like after so many things you start to, well, maybe they just didn't do their due diligence on this thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. No, thanks for parking there for a second. I think the dating of Revelation, again, is super important, because if it's late, we can easily rule out this crazy idea that a lot of this is fulfilled with the temple. And, if it's earlier, you still have to grapple with that, and consider that. And I'm obviously being a little sarcastic, but, I think it's really important, that we look at all the evidence, and that verse in particular of chapter 17, I think is a very clear from Scripture, pointing to the dating of this book. And if you look at a list of Roman emperors, you got to do some wonky things to line this up with Domitian, because he's much later on,
Doesn't work too good.
Yeah, it just doesn't line up. So no, that's really good.
Good deal.
Awesome. Well, David, I'd like to kind of close with some final thoughts. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on anything we talked about, if there's something else you want to talk about, I'd be happy to do that. Or if there's maybe some advice you'd have. I'm sure most people listening to this, at least from my circle, if anyone listens to this, it's probably the first times they're hearing these types of things. And how do we, and I think you really spoke to it very well in the beginning when you talk about a pendulum swinging. We need to be careful that we don't overswing, and some things challenge that we just trash everything we've ever learned on a topic. I think it's still helpful to have known, even if you disagree, but where would you point people for, sorting this out internally within themselves, how to see it and weigh it out, and grapple with this? That's kind of a hard question.
It's a big one because everybody is at a different stage. For those who are seeing this kind of thing for the first time and really thinking about it, like maybe hating it, because it like flies in the face of what they knew. I understand that for one, but just I would encourage you to not come away angry or bitter at me or Grant for this, but just instead take it as a chance to reaffirm your beliefs. Go back to the scriptures on the things that you feel like you are hearing from us that you disagree with, and go back and prove them out to yourself again. That's what essentially I had to do when I started hearing these types of things, is I went to the Bible, right? And I encourage you to do that thing.
So
in fact, I tell this often, but when I came to a preteristic understanding of these things.
And for the listeners, what does that mean, that word? It means fulfilled, right? In a certain sense.
It's essentially a word for the past. It means past is all
fulfilled.
it means.
Yep. That's good.
You're talking about fulfillment of prophecy being in the past as opposed to the future. And there are different flavors of that. So don't think by that I'm saying that every single prophecy ever has already been fulfilled. I'm not saying that. But there are some that believe that. So that's fine. But that's what a preterist means. But all I'm saying is that when you wrestle with those types of ideas, take it back to God, and don't take it to any other man, and don't take my word for it or Grant's. If it makes you mad, if you want to know for sure, you go back and you reaffirm it in the scriptures, right?
That's right.
And really do the study yourself, and ask God. First thing, pray to God and ask Him to show you.
Yeah, that's right.
Because every time I've done that, He's been faithful, and it didn't always turn out how I thought.
Yeah. So, and it may be some time of wrestling, it's not going to be written in the sky, and your answer, you won't see futurism or preterism in the clouds.
No. So. And then, to the people, like you said, kind of that are maybe wrestling with this, maybe they started to see some of it, started to realize some things were different than they thought. Like Grant said, I would say, don't let the pendulum swing you to a place of bitterness, of desolation, or just giving up, because a lot of people kind of somehow in there, and I've tried on my channel to help people with that, because it's quite mind-bending to realize that a lot of things that, and we have to look at our culture in Christianity, and I blame that a little bit. But we have wrapped up a lot of hope in eschatology instead of our King. And so when we have done that, we've built emotional attachments to things like a rapture, or to things like a future, something good that happens to me instead of me dying like everybody has before me. Anyway, it just, it gets emotional. I get that. But we have to somehow shake off that baggage a little bit, and not let it take us to a place of darkness. Just stay in the Word, stay in prayer, and try to keep your bearings about you as you go about learning about these things, I would say. What do you say about that, Grant?
No, that's good. And I have one other question to close this out for you, if you could help everyone out. But
sure.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. if there's anything I would want to leave as a legacy, as an impact, as a Bible teacher, to 21st century Americans is, man, you're literate. You know how to read. I posted something on social media the other day that said the person who doesn't read, it was Mark Twain of all people, the person who doesn't read is on the same playing field, essentially, is on the same level as the person who doesn't know how to read, you know? And so
Wow.
for people that you're a 21st century American, you have podcasts that are free. You got guys like me and you that are just bending over backwards, doing it the best of our ability, out of our time, to just do everything we can to help people understand the scriptures. And we have more resources that are free and available than ever before in history that I know of. And so we are without excuse, and so if we spend our life being led by people and not going to the scriptures ourselves and going to God ourselves, then what we're going to have is whoever we chose to lead us is going to take us. And that may take us to the right place, may take us to the wrong place. It could take us anywhere. It depends on the leader. And while I'm a huge fan of great leaders, I'm a bigger fan of people going to the word for themselves and being led by the scriptures themselves and studying the scriptures for themselves, letting the scriptures speak for themselves and being led in this journey with the Lord, not dependent on any man. I think it's a sad thing that we are so literate, but yet we are so clueless on what the Bible teaches. And I think the main problem, the reason for that is we're lazy, we're busy, we're occupied with less important things. And so I get being busy, I get having, responsibilities, all that stuff. But things like your podcast or my podcast, people can listen to this kind of stuff on the way to work, or people can, while they're working out. I mean, I'm always learning. I'm that kind of weird, strange guy that's always listening to something and learning. But, even if people don't go to that extreme side, they can still, grow themselves. So it's kind of long-winded, but that's what I would say with this kind of stuff. If it bursts your bubble, then maybe that's good. Maybe you need to not be so dependent upon, anything but God himself and his word,
Yeah, I would add just to that the practical aspect of this is, like you're saying, if you can do a podcast or whatever you can do. It sounds like, Grant, that you listen to a lot more stuff than I do on a daily basis. But that's good. That's great. But I would just say for the average viewer out there, or, Christian, like, who's busy, who doesn't have a lot of time, number one, don't just get discouraged, because a lot of people get into like this. Well, I didn't read the Bible today, so I'm a bad Christian.
God's going to kill me now.
And the next day they don't read it and they get even further down, and then they finally get to it, but then they stop again for a couple of days. And it's like, nobody ever told you in the Bible that you had to read a Bible every day. Right. Don't get worried about it.
Yeah.
But
right.
When you do have time, make the most of it. And I would say to do that, I would say put down the Max Lucado and the, Terry Kirkhurst or whatever her name is.
Yeah.
And pick up the Bible. And I would say, like I think I mentioned earlier in the program today, pick a book, because each of those books is a letter that someone wrote for a purpose, for someone else to understand. Read through that letter at least 3 times. And if that doesn't, I'm not saying in one sitting, but, maybe Monday you read through the book of Matthew once. That'll take a while. It's pretty big. But then maybe by the next week you've read through Matthew 3 times. You know how much better you're going to understand that letter and the overall tone and the context we've been talking about. You're not picking verses out and using the bread of life where you get a thought for the day and you read one verse and you're good, right? No, we don't want that. We want to go to these letters and put ourselves in the position of the people who got the letters. And say, what is this person saying? Why'd they say it? And really get into it, And so that's what I would encourage. If you've never done that, that is the way. That is, for me, that was the thing that turned my scriptural study around, was reading through the books multiple times. back to back, because I forget things. Like I could read it once, and if I went a year without reading that passage again or that book, I would forget most of it. But when you do that like 3 times in a row, you really start to remember, oh, and then later on you'll hear a topic and you'll be like, I remember that was in the book of Matthew. I remember it was in the first half. And then you can turn to it and you can find it quickly again. You know, I mean, it just builds your ability to place where things happen in the Bible, keep them in context. And so I would just really encourage you, if you're studying these topics at all or any others, you know, pick the book that topic is in the Bible and read through that sucker about 3 or 4 times. You'll definitely get a good idea of the context and what is being said there. So.
No, that's great. And David, you didn't get here overnight. You've been studying the Bible for a long time. So
That's true.
yeah. So I think that's something to remember, is that it's not about it's not, as they always say, the cliche, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You know, cumulative time really adds up, especially for Bible study, I think, as well. But yeah. So in closing, David, say in a minute or two, if you could give people your understanding of what is to take place in the rest of history, according to what we can discern and extract from God's Word, according to your understanding and interpretation of certain eschatology being fulfilled. What is left in God's chess match, if you will, before the culmination of human history?
So I truly believe, and my views differ a little from, for instance, a full preterist. Most full preterists, and if you study this topic, you'll learn what that means, but they believe everything has been fulfilled. There's nothing to come. And most of those guys, along with amillennialists and post-millennialists, will say that the world itself, the physical world, is going to go on forever, and that it's a matter of time that Christianity and the kingdom takes over the world, all right? Which is a very materialistic viewpoint. Kind of similar, actually, to what the Jews had when Christ came, and they wanted a king that was going to come and sweep through Rome and kill all the Romans. Well, they didn't do that, right? He didn't do that. But my view is truly that Revelation is mostly about the first century, but in Revelation chapter 20, it starts at the end of that tribulation period when Christ has conquered, right? 70 AD. And he says, then there's 1,000-year millennium. And whatever form that took, it sounds in the scriptures and in all the writings that talk about it like that's spiritual, and that has occurred. And the kingdom has since continued and will continue forever, because that is the nature of Christ's heavenly kingdom that he talks about. And so we're a part of that. So as far as us living our lives right now, it is to build the kingdom, to, as the Lord's Prayer says, may it be as it is in heaven on earth. We want to make it that way, you know, as much as we can. We are citizens of that kingdom, and we want to show the world what that kingdom's all about, because we are citizens of it. We're not there yet, but we are the citizens of that kingdom. And then in the future, as far as I understand from the rest of the book of Revelation, and just to reiterate that I've read many, many other Christian writings from the first couple centuries, and surrounding texts, both Jewish apocalyptic and Christian apocalyptic, the prevailing viewpoint is that there will be a culmination of the material world. And even the Jewish nation thought this and still holds to this, that there will be a culmination. It's not going to go on forever. That the material world had a beginning, and so it will have an end. And so I guess as far as my expectations is, I don't know whether any of that type of thing will be happening in my lifetime, but I see in the scriptures and surrounding texts that there will be a destruction of the earth, that for us as Christians, if we're alive at that time, which I'm not saying I think we will be, but we may be, that is a cleansing essentially of the earth, and we will essentially at that time go to heaven, be with him. It won't be a bad thing for us, although it will be apocalyptic as the flood was. And that's exactly how Josephus describes it. He talks about that the Jews had this tradition that once the earth would be destroyed by a flood, and at another time it would be destroyed by fire. And
As
that's
Peter
what
records.
we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Peter does seem to be talking about that. Second Peter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, so that's truly what I think is in the future. Now, as far as my life, I'm more concerned with just living my life as a follower of Christ and doing exactly what we're doing, helping others become that or become better at that. And I want to give God all the glory with what we're doing right now, with what I do on my channel. His kingdom has been established. Glory to him, glory to God and his son on the throne next to him. I just, this is where I start to get emotional, but that's what it's all about. And some people go to such an extreme with some viewpoints that they think that nothing pertains to them anymore. That is so not true that it's not even funny. We have a job to do. And if you don't think that being a citizen of the heavenly kingdom means you have a job to do, then you're wrong. We need to go back to the texts. But we have a job to do, and that's what we're doing, is proclaiming it boldly. Faith is the evidence of things not seen, and that's what we're to talk about daily, and we're doing it right now. It's these spiritual things. We're to be spiritually minded and not fleshly minded. So that is what it is about, living for the kingdom and promoting God's kingdom and growing his kingdom. And, if we are here when there's some culmination and, it's perhaps Jesus is part of that culmination. We could probably do another video on that. But as far as this goes, that's not truly important. But that to me is irrelevant. I'm going to be doing the same thing today that I will be doing tomorrow if I die and go to heaven. And I've said that before in one of my videos, that I want my transition from this life to my spiritual life in heaven to be as seamless as possible. And I think that's apparent with the things I do. And I just hope that's true. But I'm doing all this, and it's all about him. It's all about God and his son, Jesus, who is my king. So I think that somewhat answers the question, but
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. There's still kingdom work to be done, and there's still ground to be taken. There's still people that need to be reunited with our Lord and King. And there's still uncultivated things, right, that need to be cultivated by Christ and his kingdom. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would concur with that. Well, cool. David, thank you so much for coming on the channel here. I think David's going to post this on his YouTube channel as well. You can find him at Bible Scribe on YouTube. He's got some great content. I would really encourage you to check that out. And likewise, he also uploads the audio, if I'm not mistaken, to podcasts. Where can people find you if they like listening to podcasts, David?
I host it on anchor.fm, and I think it blows it out to like everything. I know it's on Apple. It's on most of the generally, used podcast platforms. So it was an easy way I could, reach that audience too. So I just kind of repost everything as audio on there. And I do have a few people that like that, I think, because like you said, they can jog with it or whatever they do. So
yeah. Awesome. Well, David, thanks so much again. We'll close out our video here, and thank you so much, man.
Thank you for having me, Grant. I just really appreciate this. This has gone really well, and man, it's just great to meet a fellow brother and be able to talk about this stuff. I'm surprised at how we're both right here, and it's good. I like it. It's good. I think this has been probably really good for the viewers, having the perspectives. I think this is just going to be great. I think a lot of people will really enjoy it. So thank you for hosting this and making it happen. So maybe we'll do more of these in the future.
Yeah, we'll see. I'd love that. I'd absolutely love that. Cool. Yeah, we'll talk about Nephilim or something, man. We'll get it going. That's what my brother told me to talk about.
That. I'll do that.
Maybe we will. Anyways, right. Thank you so much, man.
Cool. All right, man.
All right.
Well, I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Thanks again.
Later, David. Thank you.